This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come about voice to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 18. I am your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today we are going to enter into the record the second installment of the series that began last week with the 1980 October surprise. And as promised, today we're going to dive into the world that was won by that shady backroom Paris hotel room deal by the likes of William J. Casey, George Herbert Walker Bush, and others. I think the activities of the Reagan-Bush administration throughout the 1980s are truly such a Cthulhic octopod that there's probably, I very unironically, I think, posted on Twitter that the last episode was Iran-Contra First Blood / ? And this is truly a / thread that we're
it's like an ongoing creepy pasta that is always part one of ? It will never end.
I really don't think that we could put a terminal number on the end of this thread, because I am absolutely not convinced that the criminal activities that were spawned in this era have ever truly ended. In fact, I think that they are probably more integrated into every aspect of the American economy and the government, the military, law enforcement organizations than ever. And I don't think they ever really went away.
Yeah, I mean, the Reagan administration in general, I think that even somewhat less woke people do recognize that it fundamentally transformed, to use the scary Obama term, it really changed America, and in terms of its mentality and, various institutional things like the tax structure, for instance, it's completely different. People will often talk about how under Nixon there was a more extreme, there was greater taxes for the wealthiest portion of society than there is now under
sure people even point out kind of odd things that you wouldn't think of today about how it was Nixon that established the EPA, and Nixon even flirted with giving single-payer health insurance to everybody, and even universal basic income and things like that would be absolutely unthinkable for any Republican post-1980. But that shows you how the Overton window, as Glenn Beck would say, radically shifted throughout the 1980s and never really snapped back. I think, as we'll get to in this episode, any maybe of those less woke people that recognize the nefariousness of the Reagan-Bush years, but think that a certain Governor William Jefferson Clinton turned back the clock or shifted us back on a more leftward path is incredibly naive and actually could not be further from the truth.
Yeah, I wasn't really super up on most of the Mena stuff, and it really is quite damning, and it really adds a new perspective to the kind of pincer move that happened, because, Clinton, everyone sort of knows he was a Reaganite at heart, and, since his presidency, the quote-unquote left in America hasn't really recovered from some of the pieties of Reaganism. But you can really kind of see that it wasn't just an accident of doing what was popular. It was much more sinister than that.
He was plugged into a much larger agenda. And so you brought up Mena there. So today, I think, an attempt to tackle, at least in subliminal jihad terms, not take too long. So we mean maybe it'll be 3 hours, but so we don't spin off absolutely forever and ever and ever. We decided that at least for this installment, we're going to focus on one specific tentacle of the Iran-Contra project, the Iran-Contra Enterprise. And it's one that, even though this scandal, most people are familiar with sort of that term, Iran-Contra, and they're aware that it was a scandal, but this was the aspect of it that was too much of a hot potato for the Washington press corps, really the entire media, to be able to face up to. And as we'll see in this episode, a handful of enterprising journalists and whistleblowers kind of brought a lot of this stuff to light in the 1990s, and then similarly had their careers and reputations completely annihilated, and in one case resulted in the death. That would be Gary Webb, of course, who will come up very prominently in this episode. But we're going to focus on the drug connection of Iran-Contra. So we're going to be more on the Contra side as opposed to the Iran side. We talked last week about how how dare you, sir, sell weapons to the bad mullahs? That thing was almost like a limited hangout, yes. A kind of little smoke screen they put over the real scandal, because like we discussed, I think a lot of Americans could kind of write that off, or in some cases even be supportive of it. I mean, as we saw in the hearings that came out when Iran-Contra supposedly was exposed, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North kind of proudly said, basically, that, yes, so what if we were illegally selling weapons to the Iranians and then using those profits to buy weapons for the Contras? I still think, by golly, I still think it was the right thing to do to stop communism from encroaching on our hemisphere. And, a lot of Americans sincerely agreed with that, unfortunately. And it's not surprising to see that. But it's a whole nother question when you talk about would most Americans support selling guns to the Nicaraguan Contras and then accepting payment in literally tons upon tons of cocaine that was then brought into the United States and spread predominantly in urban African-American communities and poor Black communities. And as we will see in our recounting of this sordid tale, that this coincided with the innovation of crack cocaine, which then spawned this absolutely horrendous crack epidemic throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, and provided the public support for a vast militarization of law enforcement, of local law enforcement in this country, that led to many of the problems that people were marching and protesting and rioting in the streets about this year. But I think it's very fascinating that in all of this discussion about Black Lives Matter and police brutality and all these things, I have not seen a single person this year on any kind of mainstream news outlet bring up this incredibly important facet of how did we get to this point? How was this paradigm of policing rolled out to the country? How was it accepted and even demanded by voters? And, this is literally, we're living in the legacy world of the 1980s drug war. And as we see, it is not a separate issue from the Iran-Contra covert wars that were illegally, even by our, very limited and flawed bourgeois legislative system, they were nonetheless illegal at the time, and they went and did them anyways. And the consequences, to paraphrase, a certain Unabomber, have been a disaster for the human race and for Americans as well.
Yes.
So I guess where do we begin? I mean, I guess we've been following the narrative in a kind of linear fashion from the October surprise, which would take us to 1981, when Reagan and Bush are brought into office. And as I mentioned a little bit in the last episode about the interesting book that I found, Peter Schweitzer's Victory from 1994, wherein most of these Reagan officials were bragging about the full court press, like total war kind of operation, total pressure campaign that they decided to put on the Soviet Union and its allies when they came into office in 1981. This was basically a central pillar of that strategy. Now, I think we can take a whole episode to kind of talk about the sort of anti-Soviet context and all the different tentacles that had, but just rest assured that even though, of course, drug trafficking to raise money for Contra death squads is not discussed in this book, because some of these people, I mean, they had just been pardoned they were, maybe facing going to prison for doing a lot of this stuff. So they tread lightly on the Contra stuff, except to say that, yes, of course, we were supporting the Contras, but they focused more on Afghanistan and the Poland operations and things like the Strategic Defense Initiative and economic types of warfare they were waging against the Soviets. But basically, part of what became kind of known as the Reagan Doctrine was basically a reversal of Carter's somewhat more cautious approach that basically said you have to wage kind of aggressive confrontation with the Soviets and their allies and people they support all around the world. Just basically throw everything you have at it. And on top of that, especially in Central and South America, because at this time in 1979, there was a socialist revolution in Nicaragua, which was a long time, I would say, kind of a neo-colonial U.S. protectorate that had been ruled by the family of Anastasio Somoza, who is a right-wing anti-communist dictator that, much like Batista in Cuba in the 1950s, had kind of a stranglehold over the entire economy and political system of Nicaragua. But due to a lot of, basically ignoring and oppressing the vast, impoverished majority of the population, and also there was a terrible earthquake in the late 70s where I think Somoza stole most of the international aid that flowed into Nicaragua and failed to rebuild the city, and it really brought the animosity towards his regime to a boiling point. In 1979, this young movement called the Sandinista National Liberation Front, basically the FSLN, they took power in an insurrection, and Somoza fled Nicaragua. And he actually fled to Paraguay, where in 1980 some Sandinista commandos assassinated him, I believe by shooting an RPG at his motorcade and just blowing him up. So, that was pretty cool. And of course, this basically, so Carter, even though Carter was anti-Sandinista and kind of, went along with the status quo of supporting Somoza, much like the Shah, when Somoza fled and this regime toppled, Carter kind of did not step in any kind of strong way to, he didn't send any military interventions. He kind of let this happen, especially in the views of people like William J. Casey and the circles around Reagan. This was, yet another example of Carter being a total cuck and basically letting a Marxist revolution occur in a country that we considered, per the Monroe Doctrine, to be kind of a vassal state under our sphere of influence. And they became very worried that basically Nicaragua was going to become another Cuba.
Yeah, and I remember even some of this being used to, like, smear, like, even after the fact, if people on the left, like, I remember people bringing this up about Bernie Sanders, like, at some point maybe in 2016 or in this recent election, where I guess he attended some rally that was, like, in support of the Sandinistas, and that sort of supported them in other ways. And they're like, do you regret that people said, like, death to America, or whatever, or something like that, like, not even like death to America, like, but yeah, it was like after the fact of, like, supporting the Contras, like, insane rightist.
Yeah, he actually went on a trip to Nicaragua, I think maybe in like 1985 or 86, and he was welcomed by the government there, and he gave some, like, press conferences where he was speaking, I think they're doing very good with the education system, and they're providing healthcare to the people. And I mean, Bernie in a way was like, I mean, he was always kind of a trot, but he was at least kind of, like, cooler in the 80s because he would offer support to, like, Cuba and Nicaragua, and went on a little vacation to the Soviet Union, and was actually much more focused on talking about these, like, CIA covert operations and things like that, which are kind of gone from modern, particularly 2020 Bernie, really had, like, nothing to say about U.S. foreign policy in this regard, which is, you hate to see it.
Yeah, but it's crazy, like, the way that the status quo has sort of consolidated around the idea that, like, the Sandinistas were in some way bad, or that, like, this was acceptable, like, the Contra situation. Anyway, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, today, there were even more recently, because, of course, the president of Nicaragua today, it can get a little confusing, but Daniel Ortega, who was one of the young leaders of the Sandinistas and did become the president in the 1980s during the Civil War, he is still the president today. He, I believe, came back in, I think in the maybe the late 2000s, after getting voted out in 1990, which was really kind of, it was like America had a gun to the head of the Nicaraguan people and said, if you do not vote the Sandinistas out, like, we're going to continue this Contra war forever, and you will never know peace. Your country's going to get ripped apart. And so people kind of voted in some kind of moderate, more pro-Western person. But then Ortega came back. But of course, Ortega today, you really do hate to see it. He's a little bit more of a revisionist, more like a social democrat. Of course, he still is allied with Venezuela and Cuba, and there's still kind of a little bit of a spirit of Sandinismo, but also he's, like, allied with the Catholic Church now, and a lot more business interests. A lot of Contras have kind of been allowed to be rehabilitated, including a very prominent one named Danilo Blandón, who we're going to get to later in this story, who's now, like, a rich, like, landowner in Nicaragua, if he's still alive. I don't know if he's still alive, but as of, like, 7 or 8 years ago, he was back in Nicaragua, like, living high on the hog, and not in a jail where he probably belonged. But so now there's protest against, Daniel Ortega, and they have a very kind of color revolution kind of vibe to them. But like, also it's hard to, the kind of, a lot of the Sandinismo has been drained out. So even a lot of people that were involved in the Sandinista government in the 80s are a little bit more, like, ambivalent, or, some of them claim that they were kind of marginalized, pushed to the side. I actually went and saw, there was an interesting documentary that came out maybe last year called Las Sandinistas, and it was a documentary about, I went to a screening of it here in LA, and it was about it profiled a bunch of women who were prominent leaders and rose to, like, high positions in the Sandinista revolution. And it was really cool. I mean, the part of the movie that was kind of mostly about them and about the revolution, and it was pretty sympathetic and kind of almost, like, gave this, like girl power punk rock kind of aesthetic to, like, the Sandinistas, which, okay, better than fashy Western punk rock, at least. But then, kind of in the last chapter, a lot of these same people, and I don't want to cast aspersions on their disillusionment, but they did seem to be, they weren't necessarily super hardcore supporters of Ortega as president anymore. But then at this Q&A afterwards, they had some young, second generation Nicaraguan girls there who had gotten involved kind of in Twitter activism. I forget what kind of group. It was an SOS Nicaragua, #SOS Nicaragua thing, which I've seen and gave me strong CIA Color Revolution vibes the whole time. And these were college students and whatever, and some of them had come here in the 90s, and they were all kind of talking about how Sandinistas were great, and that's why we need to rise up again today, because Daniel Ortega has betrayed the values of that revolution, and he's a big bad corrupt guy now, and we need to get rid of him. And I remember kind of asking a question. I was a little triggered, and I asked a question of is there still any kind of spirit of Sandinismo in Nicaragua, with these people that used to be in the revolution? I mean, is there a constituency that still has kind of Marxist kind of socialist ideals? And they were they got a little defensive and were it's not really about most people don't care about Marxism anymore, and that's old. And basically it's just about freedom and having your voice heard and blah 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 blah. And it gave me kind of bad vibes that I'm sure these kids feel like they're doing the right thing, but that it's have you not internalized the lessons of what happened in the 80s? I mean, the United States, they're kind of acting like none of them noticed that the U.S. was vehemently against Ortega to this day, and it was probably for a lot of geopolitical reasons, and they just seemed kind of whatever, he's a bad man, and he marginalized these women, so he's a sexist, so he has to go, and it just, there wasn't a lot of room for a kind of more I don't know, it's they didn't have the fire of standing up to the U.S. and saying fuck off, we're going to run our own country. And as disappointing maybe as Ortega's kind of government is today, what is the only alternatives I see are much more right-wing kind of forces. So why would you want to are you cool with the children of Contras coming into power? Basically, it seemed like they weren't necessarily kind of mad, as long as there was kind of a liberal gloss of human rights and things like that. So that's kind of
having your voice heard is definitely the foundation for a good politics. Freedom and having your voice heard, you can't go wrong with that. That is definitely very rigorous.
I think Bill Casey and Count Alexandre de Monarchet would wholeheartedly agree. It's all about liberty and a voice of liberty being heard.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was also during the support for the Contras, there was a huge propaganda campaign that Oliver North in part sponsored, to promote to sort of whitewash the image of the Contras as being a group that could be supported, and sort of to gloss over the various atrocities that they committed and that type of thing. A huge amount of money was funneled, op-eds were written by people whose CIA connections were concealed. All these different sort of firms and orgs were funded to sort of create an image of the Contras as being something that the U.S. could in good conscience support.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan himself said multiple times, he compared them. He'd used similar language both for the Nicaraguan Contras and the Afghan Mujahideen, which basically he would compare them to the American founding fathers. He would call them freedom fighters, and he would say things like, well, if people say that, the Contras are, I think the Contras are fighting for freedom, and if you call me a Contra, well then, by golly, I think I am a Contra, and kind of stuff like that. He called himself a Contra and said he's not going to stop supporting these people, even though So they started early in the 80s. Basically, just like with Cuba, all of the rich landowners and like the bourgeoisie of Nicaragua that got run out of the country and had their like plantations nationalized and things like that, they were all incensed because, of course, their quote unquote liberty had just been taken away from them. So they started, when Reagan came in a year or so after this revolution, they finally realized, oh, like we finally have an enthusiastic ally in the White House. And of course, William J. Casey was super about stopping the Sandinistas and returning this, Nicaragua to an American-friendly government, no matter how violent or fascistic it was. So they started setting up assistance to arm the Contras. However, Congress, which at the time was controlled by Democrats, was not as on board with this. And basically pretty early into Reagan's presidency, there were 3 legislative amendments that became known as the Boland Amendments that basically limited U.S. government assistance to the Contras. So the first Boland Amendment was in the House Appropriations Bill of 1982, sponsored by Massachusetts Democrat Edward Boland, and basically the Boland Amendment proposed by Edward Boland was a highly limited, ambiguous compromise because the Democrats did not have enough votes for a comprehensive ban. The amendment gained traction due to a widespread opposition among the American public to funding the Contras. Hawley Sklar pegs public opposition to Contra funding at the time of Reagan's election at a consistent trend of 2-1. So 2/3 of Americans did not want to get involved in this fucking counter-revolutionary war. The amendment covered only appropriated funds spent by intelligence agencies such as the CIA. Some of Reagan's national security officials used non-appropriated money spent by the National Security Council to circumvent the amendment. No court ever made a determination whether Boland covered the NSC, and because the law was a prohibition rather than a criminal statute, no one could be indicted for violating it. Opponents alleged that the White House violated the amendment. Congress later resumed aid to the Contras, totaling over $300 million. The Sandinistas were voted out of power in 1990 and then voted back in 16 years later in 2006. The Boland Amendment prohibited the federal government from providing military support, quote, for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua. It aimed to prevent CIA funding of rebels opposed to the Revolutionary Provisional Junta. The amendment sought to block Reagan administration support for the Contra rebels. The amendment was narrowly interpreted by the Reagan administration to apply only to U.S. intelligence agencies, that's important, allowing the National Security Council, which is not labeled an intelligence agency, LOL, to channel funds to the Contra rebels. To block the funding through the NSC, the amendment was later changed to prohibit any funds for military or paramilitary operations. Administrative officials argued the Boland Amendment or any act of Congress would not interfere with the president's conduct of foreign policy by restricting funds, as the president could seek funds from private entities or foreign governments, also important. In this spirit, and despite the Boland Amendment, Vice Admiral John M. Poindexter and his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, secretly diverted to the Nicaraguan Contras millions of dollars in funds received from a secret deal that some alleged had explicit presidential approval, which was the sale of anti-tank and aircraft missiles to Iran, in spite of Reagan's public pledge not to deal with terrorists. In November 1986, as we discussed, a pro-Syrian paper in Lebanon revealed the secret deal to the world. This came as Democrats won back control of the Senate in the 1986 elections. In public hearings of a joint House-Senate committee convened for purposes of investigating the affair, Democrats sought to prosecute Lieutenant Colonel North for his role. The final report published after the hearings blamed Reagan's passive style of leadership for allowing the conduct of foreign policy without involvement of any elected official. So it's actually interesting there that the Boland Amendment, typical Democrats, even in the 80s, is kind of full of loopholes and lacked the teeth to actually prosecute people in the Reagan administration for violating this. And basically, but I think what's interesting in this summary is it did kind of push them to start looking at other avenues besides just direct CIA support for supporting the Contra operation, and basically use both foreign governments and private entities. And this also links up with a kind of notorious and very important executive order. This is actually signed in December 1981, and it's known to this day. It's very important. It's Executive Order 12333, and it changed a lot of rules about basically like what the intelligence agency could do and what its responsibilities were in regards to various like covert operations, and also it laid kind of the groundwork for all of these operations, and in fact like it was invoked heavily, and I think even amended by George W. Bush after 9/11 to give the executive all kinds of ridiculous authority. I think part of this was used to collect mass surveillance on American citizens. It's also there's also a clause in it, I believe, that kind of vaguely says that it has some fuzzy language in there, which I believe was kind of put in there at the behest of William J. Casey, that basically said that the CIA only has to report crimes that it's aware of related to international drug trafficking, in accordance with national security imperatives. So it left this kind of vague area, and there was also I remember Michael Rupert mentioned it in a lecture years ago. I've had trouble finding the actual like memorandum, but apparently Bill Casey himself like wrote a kind of guidance memo in the early 80s around this time that essentially said that CIA officers were not allowed to participate in drug trafficking or drug dealing, but CIA assets, on the other hand, were under no such prohibition. So
anything that's like incidental, if incidentally they benefit from any of this stuff, then it's okay.
That's going to be very important here as we dive into this. So they start to, they start giving guns, but then Congress says you can't do this through like official, CIA officers or use military stuff. So the Reagan administration didn't agree with that. So they started to set up kind of more informal private cutout networks in several different parts of the country using a number of kind of deniable assets. And I think the two main places that we're going to focus on today are what happened in California, specifically in Los Angeles and South Central Los Angeles, and a tiny little town in western Arkansas named Mena, which has a small little airport. It's not close to any highway. It's like very secluded. And this little town of Mena, Arkansas became one of the main transit points for both sending planes full of guns down to staging areas to give to the Nicaraguan Contras, and also to bring back plane loads filled with cocaine that was then distributed throughout the country. And I think, it's not a hard sell to tell anybody that the 80s were like a cocaine decade, right? It was literally ubiquitous in like American culture. I mean, it had been around before, but it was a very expensive drug, and it certainly wasn't a popular drug among poor people, right?
Yeah. Well, there were some poor people, I guess, who used cocaine, but there's definitely there were, but there was also obviously like the invention of crack and the sort of, beginning of the rift between the two drugs and their sort of use, and so that definitely did happen. But I think that there were certainly, Superfly, he's like a coke dealer, not really a crack dealer at that point.
Was he a heroin dealer? I forget.
I think that he was dealing heroin too, but he definitely did deal cocaine. I think cocaine was his main thing.
Yes. And one of the biggest drug dealers who we'll touch on the story of in a little bit, Freeway Ricky Ross, said that Superfly was kind of like his he saw that movie when he was a late teenager, and amidst kind of the poverty of growing up in South Central LA, he kind of he wanted to be Superfly, basically.
Yeah.
That's what he said. He wanted to be Superfly. And he actually, in a way, I mean, he kind of became Superfly. He almost became a millionaire in the 1980s and was the one person who, like by his own admission, kind of innovated the idea of crack, or what he originally called Ready Rock. When he started selling cocaine in the early 80s in South Central LA. And as we all know, crack went from, in a short period of time, over a couple years, it started to spread all around the country, and mostly in poor urban black neighborhoods, and became this like unstoppable scourge that tore so many neighborhoods apart, and also kind of provided the justification for an extreme ramping up of like law enforcement and prisons and things of that nature by instigating a moral panic, which again I think we'll read an article in a little bit from the Covert Action information bulletin that talks about how that in and of itself was a psyop by the Reagan administration to scare the shit out of American voters into supporting like tough on crime policies that particularly had kind of a heavy racial tinge to them. When we get to the early 80s, there are all these Nicaraguan operatives, and it appears that a deal was struck, like we said, by which they would bring guns down to Central America, which the Contras needed, and then the Contras, instead of paying for those guns in cash, they would pay for them in, kilos and tons of cocaine. And then the cocaine needed to be sold somewhere, so they smuggled the cocaine back into the United States through various CIA cutout air bases, and then distributed it down a pipeline, probably used organized crime somewhere in this link, though it's a little murky, and then eventually found its way to street-level dealers and gangs, which had kind of the infrastructure to sell it in every community around the country. And then, of course, the money that was earned from selling all this cocaine was used to buy more guns, which were then like sent back down, and were probably honestly used for a whole variety of off-the-books intelligence activities, probably not just solely the Contras. Of course, there were insurgencies and kind of left-wing movements in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala. There were various types of wars going on in all of these countries in the 80s. And the forces, it should be mentioned that these were not just kind of, anti-communist, like kind of more conservative. These were like absolutely bloodthirsty, raping and pillaging death squads that were operating under a manual, a counterinsurgency manual written by a fellow that we brought up in the last episode, Dwayne Dewey Claridge, who is the head of Latin American operations for the CIA in the 1980s, and who we mentioned was the station chief in Rome in the very early 1980s, and potentially had connections to Licio Gelli and Operation Gladio and the Propaganda Due Lodge and all of these things. And he wrote an infamous counterinsurgency manual that basically outlined all of the tactics that you should use, which I think included everything from like raping people to torturing people to assassinating, sympathizers, kidnapping, terrorist bombings, like every kind of like fascist werewolf tactic that you could imagine. Basically was like in this manual, which is authored by Claridge. I just wanted to point out here on his Wikipedia, I have to correct something from the previous week. I believe that I said that Dewey Claridge was involved in the 2012 Benghazi attacks. I think I was actually mistaken. I was thinking of a very similar veteran CIA operative. I think his name was Tyler Drumheller, who also died about 5 or 6 years ago, and I think he was the person who owned the security contractor that hired locals who abandoned guarding the compound before it was attacked, and maybe had advanced knowledge that it was going to happen. And that guy's sus as well, but I don't think Dewey Claridge was involved with Benghazi, so I will retract that. But what he was involved with, he. Just reading this, so he was born in Nashua, New Hampshire, to a quote staunchly Republican family, and he went to the private college prep Petty School, and then went to Brown University. At graduate school, he went to Columbia's Graduate School of International Affairs, and then joined the CIA in 1955. So this guy's like an old head. He then rose through the ranks of the CIA, quote, in a normal career pattern up to the late 70s, being chief of the CIA station in Istanbul, where he maintained close contacts with the counter-guerrilla, the Turkish stay-behind anti-communist organization, which I believe, is literally, even Wikipedia says, was the Turkish branch of Operation Gladio. And I think, I don't know if they're absolutely synonymous with the Grey Wolves, but they're probably a deep overlap there. Of course, one of the Grey Wolves shot Pope John Paul II. He transferred to Rome before becoming chief of the Latin American division in 1981. According to the New York Times, from his days running secret wars for the CIA in Central America to his consulting work in the 90s on a plan to insert special operations troops in Iraq to oust Saddam Hussein, Mr. Claridge has been an unflinching cheerleader for American intervention overseas. He directed several of the CIA's more notorious operations in Latin America, including the 1984 mining of Nicaraguan harbors, and when asked about his role in the mining, he said, quote, "So we decided to go big time for the economics, all right? So I was sitting at home one night, frankly having a glass of gin, and I said, the mines have got to be the solution. I knew we had them. We'd made them out of sewer pipe, and we had good fusing system on them, and we were ready. And they wouldn't really hurt anybody because they just weren't that big a mine, all right? Yeah, with luck, bad luck, we might hurt somebody, but pretty hard, So this guy, I think he also popped up in the, I watched the Freeway Crack in the System documentary about Freeway Ricky Ross's story, and Dewey Claridge popped up in a TV interview in that just like kind of like Richard Allen that we talked about in the last episode, of like somebody asking him about and he goes, "Conspiracy, that's bullshit. There was no conspiracy. Give me a break. That's bullshit. You're just stupid. You don't understand. There's never been," I think he literally said, like, "There's never been a conspiracy to like do anything bad." Okay.
There's never been one. Yeah.
I believe he was indicted in November 1991 on 7 counts of perjury and false statements. And then George H.W. Bush came in and pardoned him at the very end of his presidency.
What was his name again?
Dewey Claridge.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. And of course, also Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, Elliot Abrams, who was brought back to be like the Venezuela czar by Trump, and Robert McFarlane, who we mentioned in the last episode, and then CIA employees Alan Fears and Claire George. All of these people were actually indicted, and then George H.W. Bush, who I think maybe was a little bit, according to one whistleblower, was the mastermind of this entire operation, pardoned all of them on his way out, and that basically shut the door on talking about Iran-Contra, even though he got a little shit for it by the press. And, I don't know, that seems problematic that he did that, but he's probably just such a loyal guy, that he didn't want to leave soldiers out on the field. So it's actually a testament of his character that he pardoned all these.
And he's not president anymore. Bill Clinton's in now, so
yeah,
why bother? That's in the past. It's over.
And then people kind of wondered for a little while, would Bill Clinton, the new kid in town, would he maybe follow up and get to the bottom of this whole Iran-Contra thing? And I don't know, I guess he just got busy. He just didn't really have time for it. It wasn't like maybe he was like critically involved in the whole operation going back, because of course, who was the governor in the early 1980s in Arkansas? That was none other than young hotshot William Jefferson Clinton. And there's a documentary that I think we both watched. It's kind of long, but it's like a great old school VHS rip documentary you can find on YouTube called The Mena Connection, and it specifically goes into all the activity in Mena, and specifically how Clinton, there are so many connections that Clinton was like fully aware and read in on this whole operation, and was kind of responsible for making sure that no local law enforcement kind of went sniffing around. And
there's so many drugs being brought in to the airport in Mena, and there were like these incredible cover-ups going on. One of my favorite ones was that they made up one of the planes like that was actually being used to transport cocaine, that it was being used to transport porpoises. So there's like sus dolphin connection. The dolphins may come back. He's got a but
I think the guy who was told that said, "That's a good one." Yeah. And so the Mena Connection kind of compiles a lot of like local news, investigative reports, but also focuses on this one whistleblower named Terry Reed, who wrote a book called Compromised. It is, unfortunately, you can find it on archive.org, but you can only borrow it for 30 minutes or something, or like an hour. So, I didn't have the energy to go and screenshot every single page. I think the documentary covers, his allegations pretty well in any respect. But he was a kind of like CIA front businessman, a former military guy who got recruited into this Mena operation in the early 80s. And initially, I think, as he says in the documentary, so this guy's a little like Barbara Honegger. He starts off by kind of prefacing that he was fully on board with this Contra operation, even though Congress had forbade them from helping, and he supported the Contra struggle in Nicaragua to overthrow the Sandinistas, and if he had to do it all over again, he would still do it because he supports those freedom fighters. So keep that in mind as a little like grain of salt. But then this guy's kind of a Dudley Do-Right kind of patriotic American kind of guy, just with humble Midwestern values, and he thought that if there's a little bit of deception going on to send weapons down to these anti-communist freedom fighters, then well, hey, I'm all for it. And he got recruited by a man who said he worked for the CIA, who called himself John Cathy, and he says later he found out that this guy's name was not John Cathy, it was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who basically came to him maybe in like 1981 and said, the Reagan administration is drafting up a secret plan to destroy the Soviet Union, and we want you to be a part of it. And he explicitly pitched the Nicaraguan Contra operation as a critical node in this global secret plan to destroy communism. And so the guy enthusiastically signed up, and he was responsible for I guess some kind of manufacturing equipment that maybe they needed for military equipment that they didn't want serial numbers on and things like that. I think he was at the airport for a while, and the main honcho in the airport was a gentleman named Barry Seal, who's another like really important character. And oddly enough, there was a movie that came out a couple years ago starring none other than Tom Cruise called American Made, which is like the kind of big Hollywood telling of Barry Seal's story, which I'd heard about this script for years. I think I even found the early draft of it somewhere online and read it. And actually, interestingly, it was originally called Mena, but I think a little bit of political pressure on the studios, especially because this was being made in the run-up to the 2016 election, got them to change it to American Made, which is much vaguer and whatnot. But they shot this. I think they shot this literally like on location in Medellin, Colombia, in maybe 2015 and 2016. There was a weird incident there where there was like a plane crash and 3 individuals died. And some of them were like weird, like technical advisors with like shady backgrounds. And it's just very kind of weird that they got access to, Pablo Escobar's old stomping grounds to shoot on location. But Tom Cruise wanted to do it because he got to fly planes, and Tom Cruise loves flying planes and like insisted on doing all his own flying stunts and things like that. Even though Barry Seal was like a very rotund, almost like Jabba the Hutt kind of individual, he did not look like Tom Cruise, but nonetheless, I went and saw this movie, and the other very weird thing about it, I think it bounced between a few different directors before. Ron Howard was going to do it at one point, which probably would have totally sucked, because he's just like, I don't know, boring director. But then eventually it was Doug Liman who got the job to do it. And most people probably know Doug Liman from being the director of Swingers in the 90s. And then also the movies like Go, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, kind of a spy theme, The Bourne Identity, another spy theme, and Edge of Tomorrow, which actually not a bad movie. I think it was the one where he keeps dying. Yeah, where he keeps dying over and over again. And also like Dewey Claridge, a Brown alum. But the interesting thing about Doug Liman is that his father is Arthur Lawrence Liman, who is a very powerful and famous attorney who was probably, maybe to older people, is best known for being the chief counsel of the Senate's investigation into Iran-Contra in the 1980s. So he was almost like the Robert Mueller of like the Iran-Contra Senate investigation. And he led the investigation, and it was his hearings that were televised that most people probably remember, mainly from the testimony of Oliver North and Admiral John Poindexter. And and I guess afterwards, Arthur Liman reflected that, quote, "The public and the media tended to believe that Congress somehow had lost and the witnesses won, but Iran-Contra wasn't about winning and losing. An attempt had been made to undermine our Constitution. What the investigation accomplished was to bring all of it, in all its details, to the national attention. In this sense, I believe we all won." No, I'm sorry, Arthur. We did not all win. So he's also, I believe he has like a school at Harvard or Yale. Yeah. Yale Law School honored him in 1997 with the creation of the Arthur Liman Public Interest Fellowship and Fund for, Yale Law graduates who want to work on welfare rights, elder law, indigent criminal defense, immigration, and all kinds of other progressive things. And so I think Arthur Liman, kind of weird, like his dad was the chief counsel who ran this, and then his son ends up making a movie about the very thing that his dad's investigation failed to bring up and expose to the American people. So I don't know, maybe there's kind of some weird family thing going on there, or maybe Doug Liman is a trusted person to give this story to, because he wouldn't want to maybe overly ruin the reputation of his own father. just kind of intriguing. But I will say the movie,
like father, like son.
Yeah, a little bit, and so I think
the way he directed the original movie of the whole thing, or the father directed the original movie.
It was. I mean, as I put in the outro music last episode, this ain't really your life. It ain't nothing but a movie. Gil Scott-Heron. But it really was kind of a movie, and people, the way that they were conducted allowed for Oliver North to give this like indignant Boy Scout kind of performance where he kind of copped to doing a certain amount of things, but then said, very like Jack Nicholson and Few Good Men of like, you can't handle the truth, sir, except it wasn't anything that they actually could get him on. So, I mean, I think they did maybe indict him for lying to Congress. I mean, Oliver North famously also shredded thousands of his documents, so a lot of the evidence was destroyed. They still got a lot of things that were pretty incriminating, but so I mean the movie is actually, I mean, if you know absolutely nothing about the Barry Seal story, it at least establishes the CIA cocaine connection, and it basically, the movie does say that Barry Seal, with the blessing of the CIA, was bringing in cocaine and bringing guns down to the Contras and then bringing up cocaine. And then, it doesn't really get into like where the cocaine went from there. But it's assumed it was just going to like drug traffickers. And the framing the movie has is basically like the CIA agent, his handler, kind of gives him like maps and times and stuff like that the DEA is running surveillance flights, and basically gives him kind of the cheat codes to fly his planes in and out of the country without getting busted by the DEA, which I actually do think is a kind of real dynamic, as corrupt as the DEA is, as we'll see in certain whistleblowers like Michael Levine, who was like a deep cover narcotics agent on the kind of fantastic, I think, Montel Williams episode about all this stuff in the 90s.
I wonder if there's some kind of like subliminal intuition to like the QAnon idea of like Mueller being a white hat, like in some way that's like a return of the repressed from like Iran-Contra, like from, the idea that this is in some way managed, like it was all kind of for show. Maybe there's some kind of like, return of the repressed going on there, like some kind of subliminal intuition to that idea. That's
how do you mean? Do you mean from the Q people or the people that believe in Russiagate?
I mean, like from the Q people, like maybe there's like some kind of like subconscious like manifestation of like this happening in the past. Being played out through the idea of like Mueller being like a quote unquote white hat. I don't know.
And Mueller, I think, I don't have it at my fingertips right now. Maybe like one day we could do a little deeper dive into him, but he was involved. Actually, no, he is connected to this shit, okay? Because Robert Mueller, let me just see if I can verify this. It just popped into my brain, and he was assistant attorney general under who else? George H.W. Bush, and he was the head of the Justice Department's criminal division in 1991, and he led the investigation into BCCI, which we mentioned last week. And the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, probably the biggest like CIA criminal money laundering bank at the time in like world history. And I think he did, I'm seeing here in the LA Times, that he indicted 2 ex-heads of it, including Saudi Arabian tycoon Gaith R. Faraone, and I guess 2 other people when BCCI basically collapsed in the very late 80s. He was kind of the man that was put on the job. He was Aga Hassan Abedi, who was actually the founder of BCCI, and Swaleh Naqvi, who was Abedi's aide and was also a BCCI president. But of course, given that this is the George Bush Justice Department, so they copped the Pakistani guy who founded it and like 2 other dudes who were connected to him, but there was no investigation of kind of the basically American connections or American intelligence connections. So Mueller, you could see maybe there's a synchronicity with the Trump investigation where he's the guy that you bring in when you don't want anybody to stumble on anything that's a hot potato, that's too explosive, and you want to manage a scandal so that, and if you're good enough of a prosecutor and a bureaucratic operator, that you can do just that, where you throw a few people to the wolves and then you declare case closed, where maybe some of these like lower Trump people got indicted, but then you don't end up with like the big get at the end of it, and then everybody just kind of forgets about it. So he also was instrumental in things like the pizza connection, not related to Pizzagate as far as we know, but it was a big investigation that kind of really went after. I think I don't know really I haven't gotten to the bottom of it, but I think it's interesting that the federal government finally woke up one morning in the 80s and realized that the mafia actually existed, the Italian mafia, and started going after them aggressively after it had ignored them for decades and decades and even worked with them. And the one kind of group of people that you do not see in the Iran-Contra drug scandal is the Cosa Nostra, the Italian mafia, which I think is kind of interesting, right? And I remember a mutual friend of ours who grew up on the East Coast and is Italian American. I remember him telling me, this is anecdotal, but he told me a few years ago that his dad owned maybe, I don't know, an auto shop of some kind, a kind of small business, and that maybe his dad, it was in a heavily Italian area, and back then it was kind of totally normal that you might have some kind of protection relationship with the local mafia families there. And his dad was told by somebody who had mafia ties, basically, this is probably years ago, but that what had happened with the drug trade was that at one point the CIA wanted to move in more directly on the drug trade, maybe in the 70s or early 80s. And the mafia had, for whatever reason, declined to partner with them or didn't want them to cut in closer to the market. And basically there was some kind of disagreement between the CIA and the mafia, and their chummy relationship started to break down. And then as a result of refusing to fully integrate with the CIA, the feds started aggressively going after the Italian mafia and, has spent the last 30 odd years basically prosecuting them. And of course they're still around, but they have nothing compared to the influence that they have, they had in the 1970s. And what you see now is the replacement of the Italian mafia with Central and South American drug traffickers, with the drug cartels, right? Yeah. And so they are the main retailers, importers, distributors of narcotics. And so I wonder to what extent, this is kind of, I know James Comey and Robert Mueller both worked on those Italian cases in the 80s to take out the mafia, and got a lot of accolades for taking down the mobsters and all this stuff. But to what extent were they kind of clearing the playing field for a new kind of mafia, a more integrated mafia, to take over the global drug trade that maybe it to this day is still controlling the global drug trade? Of course the CIA was involved in drugs going back to the Kuomintang and the Golden Triangle, and in Southeast Asia and things like that. As Mike Levine said in the Montel special, that there was a scheme to smuggle heroin back in the bodies of dead GIs during the Vietnam War by the CIA. And so this is always a thing, but the cocaine connection, bringing cocaine from Central and South America, that is really the innovation of the Iran-Contra Enterprise, and it is kind of stayed with us to this day. I just wanted to mention back to Terry Reid, who eventually was like working on this assignment, and then he had a few meetings. So he claims that he had like 3 meetings with a bunch of people that he later learned were like head honchos, but he didn't know their identities at the time. And they basically asked Terry Reid and his wife to move down to Mexico to open a CIA front company that would help them smuggle weapons down to like Costa Rica and Honduras and like the staging grounds that would be given to the Contras. And he kind of he didn't really want to go, but then they kind of prevailed upon him to do that. And the people in the meeting with him, he lists about like 5 or 6 people. And the first one was John Cathy, who we mentioned was later exposed as Ollie North. There is a Japanese man named Aki Sawahata, who he still doesn't know the real identity of. Then there was a guy, and this guy's very important, named Max Gomez, who he didn't know at the time, a like Latino American CIA guy. And that guy eventually was exposed as Felix Rodriguez, Mr. I have Che Guevara's hand in my desk, and I'm best friends with George H.W. Bush. And then there was a guy named Bob Nash, who was the head of the Arkansas Development Agency that later got kind of wrapped up in all those like Whitewater scandals with Bill Clinton and like misappropriating public funds and like weird manipulation of cattle futures and maybe some money laundering activity. It also connected to the Rose Law Firm where Hillary Clinton worked. And then, you know, crucially, at 3 of these meetings was Governor Bill Clinton. And so Clinton was like there and was kind of read in on all this. And I can't forget to mention, this actually surprised me. I did not know that this person was as deeply involved, but he said that there was another guy there who introduced himself as CIA agent Robert Johnson. And that guy's real identity is none other than Attorney General William Barr. Yeah, and I knew that William Barr was the Attorney General for Bush Sr. and that he helped to draft a lot of the legal briefings that kind of justified the classification of state secrets, and basically also I think he specifically wrote up the legal justification for pardoning all of the Iran-Contra people that Bush pardoned as he left office. So some people have brought that up in the modern day, that William Barr had kind of a role like covering up Iran-Contra, but I actually did not know that according to Terry Reid, and you know these allegations were made in like 1992, so you know, Bill Barr had been maybe the Attorney General, but it's not like today where he's like, ooh, the Trump villainous AG that everyone wants to get. Like, he's a relatively obscure figure in the early 90s still. And he said, no, this guy was there, and he was like intimately involved in planning the Mena cocaine operation. And so, yeah, like all these people were, you know, according to him, were present. And then he went down to Mexico, and then at a certain point, he started getting like shipments of packages, and he thought that they were probably guns or military equipment, so he'd pass them on. But then like one day he like opened up one of the packages and it was like a ton of cocaine, and he kind of freaked out, and he went, and so Max Gomez, aka Felix Rodriguez, was his handler in Mexico at the time, and he went to him and said, hey, what's this, man? Like I don't know, there's something going on here. Like it looks like it sounds like he was a little naive. Like, I think there might be drug traffickers, like you know, that we're working with. Like, this is alarming. We have to tell Washington so they can stop it. And Max Gomez, I think his reaction was basically like, you need to shut the fuck up about this. And he basically said, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. This is like dangerous. I don't want to get involved with my family. And like, you know, Mexican drug cartels, which were on the rise at that point, already had a reputation for like wiping out your whole family if you did something to oppose them. So he wanted to get out, and then he and his wife went back to America, and then the federal government started tainting them as drug traffickers, and they started getting hounded by the feds and the DEA because, like, I guess Felix Rodriguez and the Iran-Contra people, like, seeded false information to law enforcement that these guys were actually drug traffickers. And of course, like, nobody knew that he had a covert CIA relationship. So he had to, like, go on the run, and, like, they thought they were going to get murdered and all these things. And then eventually he wrote this book in the early 90s. And there was a pretty, you know, classic in this kind of case. There was a kind of ridiculous, like, Time magazine smear job about Terry Reid in 1992 by a guy named Richard Behar. I didn't check to see if he's still around, but he wrote this very, like, snarky, you could see it today, like, totally, like, Terry Reid has made a lot of salacious allegations about Governor Clinton, like, being involved with cocaine. The problem is that none of them are true. And then just went to, like, totally attack him. I think he sued Time magazine for libel, and I think he was able to settle with them. And I guess made it out alive of this, but he, you know, he named a lot of these, like, very important individuals, and he was the one who said that this was the brainchild of George H.W. Bush. He also said that Arkansas was I guess the host of the Mena Connection described Arkansas at that time as America's banana republic. So, like, a rural, underdeveloped, deeply corrupt state, and they needed a crooked governor who was on the make and wanted to rise up and be somebody to basically keep an eye on all this stuff and make sure that none of it got out. And that was Bill Clinton. So Terry Reid got away, but the other guy involved in Mena, Tom Cruise's, you know, guy, Barry Seal, he did not make out so easily. And the American-made movie kind of does a little bit of a decent job, I guess, plotting his downfall, which was basically involved, he finally got arrested by the DEA, I think in maybe 1984, and then he was flipped into becoming a DEA informant to stay out of jail. And he was actually he was compelled, I think maybe personally, by Oliver North, who does appear in the movie. He was basically forced, as a condition of being an informant, to ensnare, to set up a drug sting that would implicate the Sandinistas, as well as, like, members of, like, the Medellin cartel that he was working with. And he had to install a video camera, or like a covert camera, in one of his C-123s, and kind of convince somebody who is maybe adjacent to the Sandinistas to be involved in this and, like, catch them on camera. And then Reagan went on TV and published this picture, this, like, blurry picture from Barry Seal's airplane, and used it to say that it was proof that the Sandinistas were involved in all the cocaine trafficking that we were seeing. So they very kind of predictably, they tried to use, because of course by 1984, 85, cocaine was hitting the streets in big time, and, you know, people were starting to see its effects in society. And Reagan, of course, was just, you know, the most staunch drug warrior. And so what's a better narrative than mixing together this idea that the Cubans and the Sandinistas, the communists basically, are the ones bringing in all these drugs to destabilize us. And of course, by doing that, by publishing that photo without blurring out Barry Seal's face, that basically burned him as a contact to everybody in the Pablo Escobar kind of cartel and all the Colombian drug lords that he had been working with, who then, you know, put a hit out on him. And then he wasn't very happy about that. So he started to kind of, he started to get increasingly paranoid and freaked out. And he started running his mouth a little bit, and he started making a lot of phone calls. And it was at a point, I believe in 1986, where he had been arrested for something and then thrown back out, but he was forced to stay in a halfway house in Baton Rouge that was, like, not a good place to hide. And at the same time, he was flirting with the idea of becoming a whistleblower to save his own ass. And he specifically made some indirect threats to Vice President George H.W. Bush that if he didn't come in and help him and get him out of this mess he was in and protect him, that he was going to whistleblow on H.W. Bush's involvement. And then shortly thereafter, in a parking lot in Baton Rouge, a couple Colombian hitmen with MAC-10s rolled up on him and riddled him full of bullets and killed him. And that was the end of Barry Seal. And according to multiple accounts, I wasn't able to find the original source of this, but apparently in his pocket, he had some notes on paper that contained George Bush's personal phone number.
According to whom?
I don't know. It was according to, I would have to look up. It might have been Daniel Hopsicker, who wrote a good and hard to find book called Barry and the Boys, which actually, so just, I don't know. Maybe it was him that made that original allegation. I don't know if I just type in Barry Seal George Bush phone number. Oh, he is. So on Spartacus Educational, I think it's kind of a socialist.
Trot,
yeah, it's like a trot,
yeah,
a hardcore trot thing.
Yeah.
So let's see. Somebody found this record. Let me just Control F for Bush. Yeah, so it says here, in March '84, Seal was indicted in Fort Lauderdale for smuggling Quaaludes and laundering money. Former undercover narcotics investigator Stan Hughes told Daniel Hopsicker in Barry and the Boys that, quote, when Barry got busted on the Quaalude thing and I heard about there being government intervention to save his ass, I didn't believe it at first, but talk to any smuggler and they'll tell you they can always buy their way out of a dope deal. In an attempt to avoid an expected 10-year sentence, Seal made contact with George H.W. Bush. He then appeared before a secret session of Bush's Task Force on Drugs in Washington, where he testified that the Sandinistas were directly involved in drug trafficking to the U.S. Seal claimed that the Medellin cartel had made a deal with the Sandinistas, awarding them cuts of drug profits in exchange for the use of an airfield in Managua as a transshipment for narcotics. The news was welcomed by President Ronald Reagan, who wanted to launch an all-out war on the Sandinistas. The DEA was now put under pressure to enlist Seal as an undercover informant with a special emphasis on the, quote, Nicaraguan connection. So Seal agreed to organize a sting operation where he managed to get a photograph of Pablo Escobar helping Nicaraguan soldiers load 1,200 kilos of cocaine on a C-123 military cargo plane. Soon afterwards, Reagan went on television with the photograph to denounce the, quote, Sandinistas as drug smugglers corrupting American youth. So as a result of that, Seal got his sentence reduced from 10 years to 6 months probation. And Seal also offered to provide information to the DEA implicating federal officials in the Iran-Contra scandal. This included Richard Benveniste, a Watergate prosecutor, interesting, who played a crucial role in the successful fight to secure the secret Richard Nixon White House tapes. Benveniste represented both Barry Seal and Bill Clinton in the early 80s, and Benveniste also served as chief counsel to the Senate Whitewater Committee. However, the authorities were not interested in this information. In December 84, Seal was arrested in Louisiana after flying in a cargo of marijuana. After paying a $250,000 bond, Seal was released to return to drug smuggling. In return, Seal provided information that resulted in the U.S. government obtaining 17 criminal convictions. According to Hopsicker, Seal told investigators between March 84 and August 85, he made $250,000 smuggling up to 15,000 kilos of cocaine while working for the DEA, and another $575,000 when the DEA let him keep the money from one shipment. And Barry Seal appeared before Judge Frank Palazola in Baton Rouge in December 85, found guilty on 2 drug felony convictions. Seal was sentenced to 6 months supervised probation. A condition of the sentence was he had to spend every night at the Salvation Army halfway house on Baton Rouge's airline highway strip. Judge Palazola barred him from carrying a gun or hiring armed guards. Barry Seal told his friends, quote, "They made me a clay pigeon." Barry Seal was asked by his close friend, Rene Martin, if he feared being killed by the Ochoa family. Barry Seal replied that he was not afraid of the Colombians because he had not implicated senior members of the organization. Seal was more worried about the contacts within the U.S. government. This view is supported by Louis Unglesby, Seal's lawyer, and he confirmed that the man Seal was willing to testify against was George H.W. Bush. And on February 19, 1986, Barry Seal returned to his Salvation Army hostel at 6 p.m. As he parked his white Cadillac, he was approached by a man carrying a machine gun. 2 quick bursts hit Seal's head and body. One of Seal's friends, Russ Eakin, observed the killing. Quote, "I saw Barry get killed from the window of the Belmont Hotel coffee shop. The killers were both out of the car and one on either side, but I only saw one shoot because Barry saw it coming and just put his head down on the steering column." One of those originally arrested, Jose Renteria, took photographs of the dead Seal in the car. When his camera was confiscated by an FBI agent in New Orleans airport, it was opened and the film inside exposed. While being interrogated, Renteria claimed that Jose Coutin was linked to Oliver North. However, this information was never produced in court, as Renteria was not charged with the murder and was instead deported back to Colombia. Miguel Velez, Luis Quintero Cruz, and Bernardo Vasquez were found guilty of Barry Seal's murder and sentenced to life terms without parole. The official story was that Jorge Ochoa had murdered Seal in order to stop him testifying at his U.S. trial. Yet Ochoa never stood trial in the U.S., nor did Seal appear to be afraid of Ochoa. His concern was with George H.W. Bush and the CIA. For example, his secretary, Dandra Seal, no relation, does not believe the Medellin cartel carried out the assassination. The CIA people, quote, "The CIA people here allowed it to happen. He had a chart. He had dirt on everybody and anybody. Further evidence comes from Dee Ferdinand. She told Daniel Hopsicker that her father, Al Caron, was a CIA paymaster and a colonel in Army intelligence, had been sent to Dallas to pay off Jack Ruby before the assassination of John F. Kennedy. She also claimed that 33 years later, Caron performed the same function for the killing of Barry Seal. According to FAA investigator Rodney Stitch, Caron was Oliver North's bagman. Richard Sharpstein, defense attorney for one of Seal's assassins, Miguel Velez, says, quote, "All three Colombians who went on trial always said they were being directed after they got into this country on what to do and where to go by, quote, an anonymous gringo, a U.S. military officer who they very quickly figured out was Oliver North." There's apparently another reason why George Bush wanted Seal dead. According to friends, Seal had a copy of a videotape of a 1985 DEA cocaine sting, which had netted George Bush's two sons, George and Jeb, picking up kilos of cocaine at a Florida airport.
Wow.
After his death, his widow, Debbie Seal, received a $29 million jeopardy assessment from the IRS. It has been claimed this is a strategy to keep her from talking to reporters. While defending herself from the IRS charge, she discovered a frequently called phone number in Barry's records. When she called it, she discovered it belonged to the Defense Intelligence Agency. She was told to, quote, "never call it again." Later that day, the DAA phoned her back. "Debbie, you're young. You have a whole life ahead of you, and you have your kids to think about. Don't call anyone in Washington again." And then, of course, this brings us to a SEAL-connected event that we wouldn't know about this if it wasn't for this. On October 5th, 1986, a Sandinista patrol in Nicaragua shot down a C-123K cargo plane that was supplying the Contras and was owned by Barry Seal. It was called the Fat Lady. That night, Felix Rodriguez made a telephone call to the office of George H.W. Bush. He told Bush aide Samuel Watson that the C-123K aircraft had gone missing. Eugene Hassenfuss, an Air America veteran, survived the crash and told his captors that he thought the CIA was behind the operation. He also provided information that several Cuban Americans running the operation in El Salvador. This resulted in journalists being able to identify Rafael Quintero, Luis Posada, and Felix Rodriguez as the Cuban Americans mentioned by Hassenfuss. It was the beginning of the Iran-Contra scandal. The C-123 cargo plane that had been shot down had previously been owned by Barry Seal. Eugene Hassenfuss later claimed it was sheer coincidence that a plane once owned by Seal was now part of a secret network led by Oliver North. So Barry Seal got. And on October 1986, the reason that we know of this scandal is because in maybe one of the greatest contributions of the Sandinistas to the understanding of real history, a teenager with an SA-7 Soviet rocket launcher shot down the Fat Lady, the C-123, and Eugene Hassenfuss bailed out with a parachute, and they arrested him and put him on TV to expose this. And then at the end of '86 is when the media, which had been ignoring any kind of rumors about Iran-Contra nefarious activities, couldn't ignore it anymore. And this plus the Lebanese news article about Iran and the weapons deals blew it up into the Arthur Lyman-led congressional investigation, which gobbled up a lot of news coverage in 1987.
Yeah, I find kind of relatedly to some of the stuff about the Sandinistas. Oh, I just wanted to mention first, you know, on archive.org when it says a book can be borrowed for an hour, you can actually, like, after your time runs up, you can just borrow it again. You know, it's not like you can borrow it for 1 hour forever. Just like
good to know. I'm stupid. I never tried
I guess it does seem, but yeah, I don't know why they do that, but yeah, you can just borrow again. But anyway, yeah, relatedly to some of the, you know, the stuff with Barry Seal and the kind of plots to sort of pin drug trafficking on the Sandinistas, I find like a lot of the sort of psyop work that was done on the American people around this to be very interesting, and like a lot of people who actually were like just straight up and like were referred to internally as like psyop specialists were brought in, like people like Daniel Jacobowitz, yeah, like who was a psyop person, background in psychological warfare, you know, and as he was ascribed to the Iran-Contra Committee by Jonathan Miller. I don't know if you mentioned Walter Raymond Jr. yet,
I don't think
but
so.
Yeah, he was like kind of the point person for that, you know, with William Casey, and he kind of like, and also Otto Reich.
Reich. I've heard that
Yeah.
name before.
Yeah. Well, you might have heard it a couple times because, of course, there's a famous SS officer, Otto Reich, or
interesting.
Reich. But this guy is apparently a son of a Cuban Catholic mother and an Austrian Jewish father, born in Cuba.
Born in Havana, Cuba, in 1945.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's enough to indict this guy without kind of speculating, but we'll just take it on faith that he's Jewish and that, you know, as it says in the Wikipedia article, his father was just very concerned when Castro took power, you know, remembering Nazi Germany, you know.
Come
right.
on. Yeah.
So,
kicking out Meyer Lansky's casinos is another Holocaust.
Anyway, but of course, like, this guy was like, you know, I think that he ended up being like indicted, or at least like obviously found sort of guilty for, like, you know, appropriating like charitable funds to get weapons and using like prohibited propaganda.
I see. Yeah, he was the head of the Office of Public Diplomacy, the OPD, starting, he helped establish it in 1983, which is like a big disinformation office. All and about supporting the Contras.
Yeah. A lot of these PSYOP people were like brought in, like people who had done like PSYOPs abroad were brought in under him and under Walter Raymond to kind of like coordinate the PSYOP campaign on the American people to make the you know, Sandinistas seem guilty even of drug trafficking, and the Contras seem like, you know, like the way they phrase it actually is like Raymond said in a memo to summarize his entire sort of propaganda campaign. In the case of Nica, you know, Nicaragua, concentrate on gluing black hats on the Sandinistas and white hats on UNO, United Nicaragua
White
Opposition.
hats. Yeah. We get that classic language.
Right. And so they actually like had planned to you know, have this sort of like fake bust happen where Jose Blandon testified before, this is according to WAPO, a Senate Foreign Relations panel in 1986, that Panama's General Noriega said that he had planned with North to plan a shipment of Eastern Bloc weapons in El Salvador, where it was to be intercepted as the long-missing proof of Sandinista gun running to Salvadoran guerrillas. The, quote, proof was to be discovered right before a key congressional vote resuming Contra military aid. But Blandon said the plan went awry when the general, angered by U.S. press disclosures about his drug trafficking, seized the ship carrying the weapons. That was in 1986, you know, so
wow.
Makes sense. But, so there's all sorts of, like, stuff, and it was just straight up, like, you know, very deliberate, very kind of unprecedented attempt to, like, manipulate the American people through the same techniques they had honed abroad.
Absolutely. We bring that up time and again, how basically like these covert operations overseas are almost like laboratories or proving grounds for tactics that they later bring back to sort of aim at like a domestic American audience. Like definitely in terms of PSYOP and propaganda.
this is a great quote from the same person. He was then National Security Advisor William Clark. Was sent a memo by Walter Raymond, and he said that we need this new art form of PSYOP in foreign policy. And he said it is essential that a serious and deep commitment of talent and time be dedicated to this. He argued programs such as Central America, European Strategic Debate, Yellow Rain, and even Afghanistan have foundered by a failure to orchestrate sufficient resources and forces for these efforts.
And we will see later on, I mean, like Rambo 3 is a fantastic example that is literally dedicated to like the brave Mujahideen fighters in the original, the title card at the end of Rambo 3.
Of course,
and then after 9/11 it was just changed to like the brave people of Afghanistan.
Right. Yes.
But that kind, and I mean, even like Rocky IV, Stallone. I mean, he was a real vector in Hollywood for this kind of stuff. But it was a full court press on the entire media, and also like I had mentioned. Maybe in like the first or second episode, but I think it's relevant here that I think it was in 1985 that ABC News was bought out by a shadowy like private equity company called Capital Cities. And one of the principal like shareholders of Capital Cities was William J. Casey, and he was mad at ABC because in 1984 they had published some like I think like 2020 investigative reports about the Contra War in Nicaragua that raised questions about U.S. covert support and like U.S. foreign policy and were like negative about the Contras, and he was so pissed off at the mainstream news, at the fake news, if you will, that a company that he was intimately connected to bought ABC News outright. And then that basically, it's like ABC wasn't, not that they were great before that, but like ABC was kind of Capital Cities from that point. And then that entity merged with Disney in the 90s. So you see, like, they really went far to get literal, like, board, like shareholder control over some of these news organizations. And then also I see here that Reich met with a dozen NPR reporters in the 80s about their allegedly biased Nicaragua coverage. And Reich, according to Foreign Affairs correspondent Bill Buzenberg, Reich bragged that he had made similar visits to other unnamed newspapers and major television networks. Reich said that he had gotten others to change some of the reporters in the field. And Buzenberg told someone in a 1987 interview that he viewed Reich's comments as, quote, a calculated attempt to intimidate. So, he also, the OPD helped circulate a specious story in 1985 suggesting that some U.S. reporters received sexual favors from Sandinista-provided prostitutes in return for favorable coverage. And he said, it isn't only women, Reich told New York Magazine. For gay journalists, they would procure men. Okay, that is especially interesting because we don't have enough time to talk about it today, but when we finally do an episode on like the Franklin Ring and even the Henry Vinson sort of gay sex ring that was in Washington that was connected to Craig Spence, who was connected to Larry King, and all these people were in like the very close orbit of Vice President Bush's office in the late 80s, that I think this is yet another case of projection of accusing like the communists or the liberals of doing exactly what you are doing, which is probably providing sexual favors to journalists to entrap them and ensure that they only get positive coverage. As far as I know, that was not a tactic of the Sandinistas. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. It'd make a lot more sense that these cocaine cartels were using prostitutes to bribe people, which many, whistleblowers have said is, standard operating procedure.
Because you do hear that come up a lot, like even among people who are like involved in the drug world. Like, you mentioned the idea, like, I feel like a lot of, like, rappers from this time will circulate that idea. Like, when we do our episode kind of on Memphis Horrorcore, which will be, like, our next public one, I guess, I think Koopsta Nika is now, like, a big, proponent of that idea that people are, like, forced to have these sort of liaisons in order to like make it so that they can later be kind of blackmailed or whatever. It's interesting,
in the music
how
industry,
that kind of circulated. Yeah,
I've definitely heard that. I've heard various rappers kind of talk almost in a kind of like Illuminati adjacent way. That, like a lot of thing about like maybe a lot of like these hard gangster rappers have to do like gay stuff to like basically blackmail them, and
well, it's interesting.
A lot of
kind
whispers
like
about that kind of thing.
Yeah, this thing where like kind of starts with drugs, and then the typical kind of story of this stuff. Where like I remember the scopolamine like rumors and things around that. So I feel like there's a connection between like that sort of conspiracy theory and the drug one that kind of has bubbled up from various corners. So definitely. And I mean, the Franklin scandal is probably the best like actual substantiated like proof of something like that. So it's interesting. Yeah.
We have an obligation to be of help where we can to freedom fighters and lovers of freedom and democracy from Afghanistan to Nicaragua.
Aren't you advocating the overthrow of the present government?
Not if the present government would turn around and say, all right. If they'd say, Uncle,
Real quick, I just want to mention, like, maybe before we go fully into, like, the LA connection and the Dark Alliance and, like, CIA crack and stuff, did you get a chance to watch any of The Last Narc on Netflix?
I didn't watch any of it, no.
Okay, that's fine. I had watched it
The Last Narc,
a month or two. It's like, it is interesting, and it always perplexes me why, like, Amazon is producing such documentaries, given their, like, close ties to the government and, like, just, I don't know, these streamers, like, they do these, like, kind of CIA, like, expose kind of documentaries, but I will say that, like, it's pretty good. It's worth watching. Somebody in the Alwara Frequency Discord chat, like, brought up if we had checked it out yet. And I think for anybody's, like, seeking a little more of, like, a kind of, personal testimony about what happened in Iran-Contra, just to go over it, like, real quickly. So it's like a mini series that covers a particular story that was kind of a big scandal in the 80s, which was like the abduction, torture, and murder of a DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena. And actually, like, Michael Levine, the DEA guy who went on Montel, was, like, friends with Kiki Camarena and wrote about it in, I think, a couple of his books. Like, this was a radicalizing event for him because, like, his friend got kidnapped, presumably by the Guadalajara cartel, and this is in Guadalajara, Mexico, in the mid-'80s. And then his, like, body was found, like, horribly tortured and basically, like, beaten to death later on. And it caused, like, a minor international incident between the U.S. and Mexico in the late 80s, but then was ultimately completely basically covered up. And the main subject of this is, like, a kind of very colorful, like, older Mexican-American retired DEA narc named Hector Berreyes. And he was also, I think, down in Guadalajara in the 80s and was friends with Kiki Camarena and was, very, like, disturbed and, outraged by like this kidnapping and murder thing, and naturally like wanted to get to the bottom of it, and eventually was actually, the DEA did appoint him to be like the head of the investigation, and this was like a really true, really personal case for him. But as he started to dig into it deeper, he found that there were all these nefarious connections, and there was this lurking influence of the CIA that was stonewalling his ability to kind of figure out what actually happened. And to make a long story short, I mean, it's like a 5-hour series, but what they can kind of stitch together today is that basically Kiki Camarena was targeted because he was a kind of not dirty DEA narc who actually wanted to deal a heavy blow to the Guadalajara cartel, which was at the time like one of the first big Mexican drug cartels that rose to power in the 80s, and was basically kind of this is when Mexico became a critical transshipment point for cocaine that was coming up from Colombia and Bolivia and Peru from like right-wing dictatorship Nazi associated regimes there, I might add. And then the Mexican, and then coming through like people like the Contras in Central America, and then when it gets to Mexico, they would kind of deal with like getting it up to the U.S. border and getting it into the U.S. And so Kiki Camarena stumbled upon something that he, I guess, should not have stumbled upon, which was, and this is very funny, he discovered a huge marijuana ranch called Rancho Buffalo. Which is like, no, for not saying there's a Buffalo JA connection, but still it's hard not to feel it.
Think of that. Huh.
Yeah. I mean, I immediately thought of it. So but basically like he discovered this ranch, and then he got the Mexican army to go raid it, and then they burned the entire crop of this like vast marijuana farm, which allegedly cost the cartel like billions of dollars in revenue. This is one of like their biggest marijuana farms. And the three heads of the cartel, Miguel Gallardo, Ernesto Carrillo, and Rafael Quintero, who were like some really like psycho, they interview a lot of like former corrupt cops who were like literally guards for like the cartel bosses, because they go into just how ridiculously corrupt even back then the Mexican military and law enforcement were. And there was a specific agency called DFS, which was literally created by the CIA after, I think in either the 50s or 60s, that was kind of an internal security kind of Gestapo that was, involved in all kinds of like anti-communist suppression activities and disappearing, journalists and people like that. And basically, the heads of the cartel were outraged. And I think the reason they were outraged is because they were all working with the CIA. And the CIA had assured them that they were going to be protected from any big kind of raids or operations against them. So the fact that this DA office, which had people in it that were on the payroll of the cartel and people that probably were aware of the CIA thing, they basically said, what the fuck? Something needs to be done about this guy, because he just cost us like almost $1 billion. And so then shortly after doing that raid, Camarena was abducted off the streets one day. He was taken and he was tortured. And the reason he was tortured was because it's like he had stumbled into an area that he wasn't supposed to stumble into. And eventually this Cuban American guy shows up. That is heard on the videotapes they procured, or the audio tapes they procured of his interrogation. And it's this mysterious Cuban-American operative named Max Gomez, who we eventually learn is, yes, Felix Rodriguez, George H.W. Bush's best friend. And he shows up a couple days into the torturing and the interrogating, and is basically like, they think he knows something that he actually didn't know. Kiki Camarena actually was like totally oblivious to like the CIA connection. So Rodriguez starts interrogating him about like, what do you know about the Contras? Like, what do you know about the CIA? What do you know about these operations? These different operations going on. Like, who are you working for in Washington that is trying to disrupt what we're doing? And thought there had to be somebody behind him. And he just keeps saying like, no, senor, like, no, like, I don't know anything. Like, I'm just like a narc. Like, I don't, and Rodriguez did not believe him. And so what they kept doing is like torturing him until he passed out, and then injecting him with amphetamines to wake him back up so they could torture him more and make him talk.
Wow.
And they just did this for like days and days and days, and then finally like his body like gave up, and I don't think they like, you know, shot him or whatever, but he just like died from like the extremity of the torture.
That could happen from what you described.
Yeah, exactly.
Necessarily shooting needing to happen. Yeah.
It was some like kind of brutal but like sophisticated, like honestly like Phoenix program, which Felix Rodriguez was heavily involved in, and brought a lot of lessons of the Phoenix program to Central America in, you know, teaching the Contras and the other, you know, security force, like these fascist security forces that were in bed with the CIA, teaching them all the most horrible kind of counterinsurgency techniques imaginable. And then in the late 80s, like they managed to actually arrest like the doctor who was there, who was like giving him injections the whole time. And then they brought him, they actually, the DEA like allowed what's his name, Hector Berreyes, the sort of quote good guy, DEA narc, to literally kidnap this doctor and bring him to America, which caused another kind of international incident. But then it was like, you know, America's more powerful, so we were like, fuck off, like we're gonna do what we want. And then they brought him into trial, and then to Berreyes' shock, the defense brought in Kiki Camarena's DEA supervisor from Guadalajara, and basically kind of asked him about this doctor who was like a rich guy, and I think he might have been related to one of the cartel heads and stuff. And this guy just this DEA supervisor lied out of his ass and basically said that like there's no way that this guy would have anything to do with cartels. He's clean, he's totally innocent, and there's nothing wrong with him at all. And that, like, the fact that Kiki Camarena's own supervisor like testified on behalf of the accused kind of collapsed the credibility of the whole case. And the doctor got out and like was delivered back to Mexico, and then the government started investigating Hector Berreyes for his like rogue activities and like kidnapping an agent, even though he was told to go kidnap the guy. And his career was kind of like disrupted by that and sidelined, and like all the blame was put on him for doing this problematic thing, and, you know, taking somebody and like violent. And they even use this kind of like sentimental propaganda narrative of like this poor doctor, like this Mexican man who was just cruelly abducted by these American agents, and like all this kind of bullshit. And basically he wanted to keep looking into the case and like get to the bottom of it. And one day he like got a visit from like a CIA guy who sat him down and was like, "You have a nice family, right?" Just like Barry Seal's wife. Like, "You have a nice family. You're still pretty young. You're a good agent, you know? You could have a long, nice career ahead of you. Or not. Because if you keep looking into this, we're going to hand you over to the Mexicans because you committed a felony in Mexico by kidnapping that guy. And we all know, given what you've done to the cartels, you're not going to last like a week in Mexican prison." And the guy was like, "I knew he was 100% fucking right. Like, I would be fucking murdered immediately in Mexican jail." And says basically like, you need to stop looking into this and shut up and just enjoy your life and enjoy your government job, and then everything will be fine. Wow. And it was at that point where he was like absolutely disgusted. I think he retired from the DEA after that, and then I guess decided to speak in like this documentary because he's like an old tortured. Honestly, some of the police, the Mexican police officers who worked for the like there's one guy in it who literally looks like he's like struggling with like demonic possession.
Wow.
And he's wearing a bulletproof vest the entire time during the interviews, like in his own home.
Wow,
he's like fully armed. I
want to watch this now.
Yeah, no, it's worth checking out.
Not doing so.
It's worth checking out because he just like does these like he'll like slam his hands on like the table and like look around wildly like a cartoon character, and then like when he just asks him any kind of question, he's like so haunted by like the horrible like satanic things that he was like involved in, and like being a dirty cop. cop. Like some of the other cops are a little more like stone-hearted about it, but this one guy in particular is like completely on the brink of like madness because of like recalling these things, and it's just So I mean, there Felix Rodriguez goes again, and this guy is like so tight with George H.W. Bush, and like literally like, and I guess was maybe either a top operative or maybe a station chief in Mexico in the 80s, because Terry Reid, it totally syncs up with Terry Reid saying that Max Gomez was going to be his CIA handler in Mexico. So they don't even bring that up in The Last Narc, but that's like a kind of a corroboration that Rodriguez was kind of based out of Mexico at that time and was managing all of this like drug pipeline business that was going up into the United States. So I would say check it out if anybody has time. It's definitely an expressive it's an evocative telling and pretty well like produced. Like I'm surprised that I mean a lot of the subjects still seem terrified to talk about it and are kind of like, well, like at one point Hector Barraez like pulls out his like 357 Magnum and he's like, you think I think I'm safe? Like, man, like no, like I carry a gun with me everywhere I go. Like he still thinks that like one day like some cartel CIA backed people are just gonna roll up on him and like take him out, for talking, but he doesn't give a shit. He's old and like depressed and doesn't give a shit anymore.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for being with us tonight. Donald Gregg still serves as your trusted advisor. He was deeply involved in running arms for the Contras, and he didn't inform you. Now, when President Reagan's trusted advisor, Admiral Poindexter, failed to inform him, the president fired him. Why is Mr. Gregg still inside the White House and still a trusted advisor?
Because I have confidence in him, and because this matter, Dan, as you well know, and your editors know, has been looked at by the $10 million study by the Senate and the House. It's been looked at by the Tower Commission. The Rodriguez testimony that you put on here, I just think it's outrageous because he was totally vindicated, swore under oath that he never talked to me about the Contras, and yet this report you're making, which you told me, or your people did, you have a Mr. Cohen that works for you, was going to be a political profile. Now, if this is a political profile for an election, I have a very different opinion as to what one should be. But Don Gregg works for me because I don't think he's done anything wrong. And I think if he had, this exhaustive examination that was gone into by the Senate and by the House would have showed it. And you've impugned my integrity by suggesting with one of your little boards here that I didn't tell the truth about what Felix Rodriguez. You didn't accuse me of it, but you made that suggestion. And other people in the meeting, including Mr. Nick Brady, and he has said that my version is correct. And so I find this to be a rehash and a little bit, if you'll excuse me, a misrepresentation on the part of CBS, who said you're doing political profiles on all the candidates, and then you come up with something that has been exhaustively looked into.
Mr. Vice President, what we agreed to or didn't agree to, I think you will agree for the moment, can be dealt with in another way. Let's talk about the record. You say that we've misrepresented your record. Let's talk about the record. If we've misrepresented your record in any way, here's a chance to set it straight.
Right. Now, I just set it straight on one count because you implied from that little thing, I have a little monitor sitting on the side here, that I didn't tell the truth. Now, this has all been looked into.
Where did we imply that, Mr. Vice President?
Well, just here on this board where you had the idea that Bush says that he didn't hear about the Contra supply from Felix Rodriguez. Felix Rodriguez testified under oath. He has been public, and you could have at least run a little picture of him saying that I never told the Vice President about the Contras.
Now we've talked about Mena, and we've talked about some things that happened in Mexico, south of the border, etc. But now maybe we can focus on like the specific Los Angeles Contra crack connection that centered around Freeway Ricky Ross, who's one of the most successful local cocaine dealers in 1980s Los Angeles, but who was supplied by a shadowy Nicaraguan businessman named Danilo Blandón, who it later was exposed was working as a kind of contract agent for the CIA, specifically to do with providing financial and logistical support for the Contras in Nicaragua. And these allegations did come out in the news in the 90s, largely as a result of the efforts of a San Jose Mercury news reporter named Gary Webb, who started a series that he called Dark Alliance in 1996, where he got a tip onto this like Blandone connection. And the result of his investigations laid out a pretty convincing collection of evidence that the CIA was like not only like indirectly like connected to the flood of cocaine into the United States throughout the 80s, but was like actively aware of it and protected its assets who were doing it from getting busted by like local law enforcement and the DEA. And even that led to certain allegations that perhaps the CIA or the U.S. government or the Reagan administration deliberately took this cocaine product and sold it in urban black neighborhoods, and did that even though maybe the CIA did not explicitly invent crack. I think, Rick Ross has always claimed that that was like a sort of business innovation of his, just because people wanted to smoke it, but it was kind of cumbersome to like freebase cocaine and kind of, clumsy and messy. And it was almost like a McDonald's style innovation of like, well, if we cook up this cocaine with baking soda, we can cook it up into this like highly potent little crack rock. And then it's like the original name for it was Ready Rock, that basically you could come up and buy it and like smoke it right away. And this was incredibly popular. And also crucially, what it allowed people to do is it took cocaine, which, like, as we mentioned up to this point, was kind of a drug more favored by rich people and middle-class people that had some money to spend, because it was quite expensive. I remember reading one book about Hollywood in the 1970s that said that cocaine was the equivalent of like $400 a gram or something like that. And I think that was in 1970s dollars, which is kind of mind-boggling compared to like how cheap it is today. But basically, if you wanted to expand the market for cocaine use, maybe the two best ways to do it would be, one, increase the addictiveness of it, because cocaine is addictive, but it's nowhere near as addictive as crack. And two, create a version of it that is cheap enough that people without a lot of money can buy it and get, addicted to it. And that is exactly what happened, starting in, I think, 1982 or 1983, when Ricky Ross started making this crack, and it was selling like hotcakes. He was making over $10 million a week by his own estimation by the kind of early 80s, and eventually started to sell to street gangs, primarily the Bloods and the Crips, who, like, in his estimation, he just wanted everybody to get in on this amazing like financial opportunity that he was doing. Yeah. He comes off, he's a very interesting figure. Like I said, I rewatched the documentary Freeway, Crack in the System from like 9 years ago, and he does come off as this oddly, I mean, especially in a story so full of like evil characters, he's like this one guy that you can kind of has a bit of humanity and like innocence to him, in that
it's interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. Like, one wonders, like, the sort of process behind his sort of rise to that position, the choice of him. Yeah, he's someone who's kind of managed to launder this whole thing into a whole, like, persona, a whole kind of career in a way.
Yeah. Even though it gets tough, because he was also somebody that got like the whole ton of bricks in a kind of very potent metaphor for what the entire like this whole 80s drug operation was. It's like of course, like the young black man was the one who got sentenced to life in prison and got like the full force of the law thrown at him, though he was able to get his life sentence overturned on a technicality and ended up getting out of jail after like 15 years. But basically,
he definitely suffered more than a lot of the people who were more involved and probably guilty of worse. But
Yeah, exactly. And of course, famously, his name was appropriated by I always thought, very mediocre Florida rapper Rick Ross, who used to be a corrections officer and a parole officer, so literally a cop, not a drug dealer, but who stole his name and then built this like ridiculous image as like this South Florida drug kingpin. And Ricky Ross actually sued him when he got out of jail for like $10 million and half of his royalties for identity theft, basically. And quite cruelly, it shows this in the documentary, the judge in LA threw out his suit on the technicality that the statute of limitations had expired because it was like too long from the time that Rick Ross adopted that name, and then ordered Rick Ross, the Freeway Rick, to pay all the legal fees of Rick Ross, which were like $500,000, and then he had to sell his mother's house in South Central to like cover the legal fee. Yeah, so like really, this is probably around like 2010, 2011, and so yeah, they just did him dirty like that again. It's a little,
that's rough.
Yeah, I know. He's gone on like different podcasts and like interviews over the years and stuff, and I think he's still kind of around there. I don't know what he's doing nowadays, but he does come off as somebody who is genuinely like naive, ambitious, greedy, and enterprising, extremely enterprising, and just sort of when he got into cocaine, it was still like this party drug. So maybe a little more what you might think of like ecstasy today, or it's not really looked at as like super addictive. Of course, you could develop a problem with it like you could with anything, but it seemed kind of like it was. He said, I wasn't seeing like crack mamas or kids doing it. It didn't seem like I was destroying my community at first, and then crack.
Right. There were no coke mamas, or there weren't any coke. You didn't see any coke babies, although obviously there can be.
And there were later on, but and then he developed this kind of idea, and then he, around the same time that I think shortly before he developed this kind of idea of like Ready Rock, he had somehow come into contact with this like Nicaraguan, Danilo Blandón, who kind of took Freeway Rick under his wing and also basically promised him like an unlimited supply of coke. And basically said, like, as much as you can sell, I can provide. And they developed a very close working relationship, and like he became, Danilo Blandón became the supplier of Freeway Rick. And so crack began to, around 83, 84, started to explode onto the streets of South LA. And within a couple years, basically started to spread, maybe allegedly, via the Bloods and the Crips, who had contacts, obviously, in other cities around the country. It started to spread to places like Detroit, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Miami, New York, and so on and so on. And usually it was primarily spreading in more low-income, majority black neighborhoods. And by about 1986, 87, it blew up into what we now would all call like the crack epidemic, but was actually very consciously whipped up in the media as this terrifying frenzy of this horrible new drug that was like escalating everything awful about the scourge of drugs in America. And it was spun in a way that it fit incredibly neatly into the Reagan-Bush administration's agenda of being like tough on crime and supporting harsher criminal justice penalties, supporting the drug war, which I think we mentioned that George H.W. Bush was literally like the chair of like the Presidential Task Force on Combating Drugs, which is hilarious, so he was like literally controlling both ends of it. Like talk about a sinister dialectic.
Yeah, very sinister dialectic.
Dope man, please can I have another hit? The dope man said, "Clock, I don't give a shit if your girl kneel down and suck my dick." It all happened and the guy tried to choke her. Nigga didn't care, she ain't nothing but a smoker. That's the way it goes, that's the name of the game. Young brother getting over by slanging cane. Go around this making 14K heaven. Bitches clocking on the dick 24/7. Plus he's making money, keep the bass heads waiting. Rolling 6-4 with the fresh ass Dayton's. Living in Compton, California, CA. It's Uzi up your ass if you don't get paid. Nigga begging for credit, he's knocking out teeth. Clocking much dollars on the 1st and 15th. Big water money, nothing less than a 20. off your own supply. Remember, keys to a G is all about money. 10 beats for a 10 bass pipe comes free. And people out there not hip to the fact, if you see somebody getting money for crack, he's the dope man, dope man. Yo, man, give me a hit. Dope man, dope man. Yo, man, fuck that shit. Dope man, dope man. We just can't quit. Dope man, dope man. Well, suck this, bitch. Wait a minute. Who the fuck are you talking to?
Kind of, yeah, I do wonder about the persona, like the fact that there was Rick Ross the rapper, like the persona of Rick Ross is so appealing, like as a folk hero, and it was still like, it coincided with that time where this like became in a way like cool across the board, and there's also that dimension of it, and I don't know,
it is fascinating, and I think I think we can probably like devote a lot of time in our like a Memphis horrorcore rap episode to the idea to like to what because it is. I was listening to NWA this morning and just to get ready to get hyped for like this episode, and I was listening to like Dope Man and some Eazy-E stuff, and it is kind of like fascinating to witness like the transformation of this like new genre hip hop, and it's so hard because like I have kind of an attachment to like NWA from being like, you know, in middle school and getting like, you know, the cassette tape and like listening to all these songs and being kind of shocked and like titillated by these narratives of like life on the streets of like South Central and the kind of the shocking violence, the prevalence of drugs and like the aggressiveness of everything. And it's like on the one hand, I think often today you would see people describe that as almost a form of like artistic journalism, right? Like it was speaking to what was really going on and was absolutely going on the streets of where these kids were growing up at the time. But then maybe you have to separate that a little bit from the creation of the art itself and then it becoming a mass promoted phenomenon in culture that became kind of like the most dominant subgenre of rap was this stuff that glorified drug dealing. And
I mean, yeah, there's two sides to it. I mean, something you can, again, we're going to do an episode on like the specific sort of subgenre of horrorcore rap in Memphis, like coming up soon. But like, you know, something like Norwegian black metal that is like, you know, like burn a church, like kill every Christian, you know, like people, you can make the same excuses like for that, but like ultimately, like, you know, there's two sides to it. Like, you know, this is kind of the debate and like the thing that we deal with a lot of the time, like on the show, where it's this, you know, and there's different elements to it depending on like the different social context, of course, but it's the, you know, the line between like this idea of free expression, like everyone's free to worship Baphomet, you know, etc., versus like, okay, well, can we have a conversation about like, you know, what this might in some way bring about, you know, as, you know,
exactly.
Like, so it's it's obviously like a very like thorny territory, and in a way like, yeah, there's observation, you know, and there's sort of response, and there's like, you know, like you said, the journalistic aspect of it, and then there's the way that those narratives can kind of perpetuate and shape certain realities. I mean, and you could say the same thing about a song like Smuggler's Blues. You know, like
you may have already heard before, but you're definitely hearing it in this episode.
There's a mystique, you know, that comes to the Smuggler's Blues narrator. You know, like he's cool, he's sexy, he's appealing. You know, like
it's the lure of easy money, and it's got a very strong appeal.
He's the all-nighter. You know,
he is the all-nighter.
Yeah, exactly. So there's. Yeah, for sure. There's like
that song. I feel, you know, not to get sidetracked, but I do feel maybe I will have played that interlude already. But the part where he says, you know, they bring it to Miami, sell it in L.A., they hide it up in Telluride, it sounds like he says, and Mina's here to stay. And it actually like it blew my socks off when I first heard this song like a year and a half ago, going through kind of like an Eagles binge, and I was like, whoa, did Glenn Frey just exposed the Mena operation in 1984 in like one of his songs about cocaine smuggling. And then I looked at the lyrics and it's like he's supposedly saying, I mean, it's here to stay. It's when he's like exhaustedly like testifying to like the drug cops that caught him. And he's like explaining like, listen, buddy, like you don't understand, like, you know, from the office of the president right down to me and you. It's
well, I find that phenomenon fascinating of like mishearing, like what is getting something wrong, you know, what does mishearing get right in a way, you know, what are mistakes, like it's like kind of like, again, you know, reference to another episode, S.K. Bain and the Black Christmas thing, like completely wrong, like, and a lot of the things he says, like you could say, like, especially related to that, are like totally out there and like based on nothing, but is there something to it in a way, like, you know, there's something to like some of these things that are paranoid, like grasping at you know, nothing, that are largely like, is there something going on with error, and and mishearing in particular. I have many things like that where I've heard something wrong, or I prefer my misheard lyrics or something like that.
I've had that feeling before. But to get back to crack a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit from this article from the Covert Action Information Bulletin from 1987, which I found on the CIA's website, but is a really good, we'll link it. It's a really good, I think, compendium of articles about the history of like CIA drug trafficking, going back to, you know, Burma and the Golden Triangle and the Nugan Bank and all the way up through like Contra cocaine. But this is specifically about the domestic disinformation campaign around crack. It's called Drugs, Politics, and Disinformation by Richard Hatch. And it says, if 1985 was the year of the terrorist, 1986 was the year of the drug hype. The drug panic last year was just the latest in a series of disinformation themes manufactured and nurtured by the White House to help the Reagan administration pursue attacks on domestic freedoms and divert attention from more pressing social problems. Throughout 1986, a tide of articles and TV news reports on illegal drugs, particularly the smokable cocaine derivative known as crack, washed through the media. From March to October 1986, NBC News aired more than 400 reports on drugs. CBS received the highest ratings ever recorded for a documentary with its 48 Hours on Crack Street. And along with hundreds of other articles, the New York Times ran almost 2 full pages daily for the week of the President and First Lady's drug crisis living room speech. Although most of the furor was over crack, the anti-drug crusade lumped all drugs together as an evil threat. Yet by early 1987, the torrent had dried up. There were no more TV specials with Dan Rather or Geraldo Rivera undercover on drug busts, no 2-page spreads in the Times, no more presidential speeches. What happened? The truth is that there was no crisis. The panic was manufactured primarily for political gain. The Reagan administration had refined its techniques of disinformation by allowing the Contras and other mercenary groups to traffic in cocaine to raise money for political purposes, then citing the resultant drug use in its attack on political freedom. The administration's war on drugs was as hypocritical as its refusal to trade arms for hostages. The war against drugs, meanwhile, assumed the existence of an epidemic. However, throughout the period of intense media coverage, the use of illegal drugs, with the exception of crack, continued a years-long decline. While Newsweek editorialized that, quote, an epidemic is abroad in America, as pervasive and dangerous in its way as the plagues of medieval times, the actual number of drug users in the U.S. decreased, especially among the young. The absence of an epidemic is confirmed by figures from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the primary governmental body charged with monitoring drug usage. NIDA statistics show that the number of hospital emergency room admissions and deaths associated with drugs stayed fairly constant from 1983 to 1986. At the height of the crisis, the numbers dying from cocaine still did not greatly exceed the total dying from over-the-counter painkillers like aspirin. Alcohol in combination with other drugs killed twice as many as cocaine. Former NIDA head Carlton Turner admitted it was, quote, not an epidemic now. It was one in 1981, but people are just now discovering it. In short, the epidemic consisted of perhaps an increase of 200 to 300 deaths among heavy cocaine users due to an increase in the availability of cocaine. Anatomy of a propaganda campaign. How did the notion of a drug epidemic propagate through the media? The methodology of the propagators is familiar. quote, friendly administration assets appeared on talk shows, wrote editorials, and testified before Congress. In turn, their statements were used by, quote, grassroots movements backed by the administration. In this aspect, the war on drugs resembled other Reagan administration propaganda campaigns, such as those of the, quote, yellow rain myth and the, quote, Bulgarian connection. I think that refers to the idea that the Bulgarians shot Pope John Paul II.
Yeah.
And yellow rain was that. I remember that being in my science textbook in middle school, saying that like communist countries have acid rain and like blah blah blah.
Well, there was the idea they used chemical weapons, like on in Cambodia and in Vietnam somehow. But yeah, it's interesting. Like there's a lot of different theories about it, including that there actually was a U.S. origin to it. The mention of it by Walter Raymond was interesting. Maybe he just meant like, oh, people didn't believe the truth of yellow rain, but it was interesting how like, it kind of was ambiguous whether they were like, oh, our attempt to make this up failed. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah. This is where it gets extra bizarre. The anti-drug craze of the mid-1980s was in large part a recycling of a carefully managed campaign of the early 70s, when President Nixon's war on drugs was designed to bolster his law and order image before the 1972 election. The new campaign had a similar function in the 86 elections. Indeed, the personnel involved in the 1970s were at a large degree simply remobilized. In many cases, quote, evidence originally produced more than a decade before and since contradicted was dug up and recycled as, quote, proof of the epidemic. The, quote, experts. An examination of the experts employed in the latest drug war quickly centers on a group of scientists and bureaucrats who have lobbied against reforms of drug laws for nearly 15 years. These experts form a mixed bag of former DEA officials and scientists, including some who conducted secret research for the CIA and Department of Defense. They mean MKUltra. One such expert is Peter Benzinger, former head of the DEA. He left the DEA in an apparent dispute with President Reagan over a plan to cut its budget and formed a consulting firm to advise business on drug problems. At the height of the anti-drug campaign, he appeared on Meet the Press the morning of Nancy Reagan's chat with the nation to claim that the economic damage to the U.S. was $230 billion and urged children to turn in their parents. In addition to the, quote, consultants to industry like Benzinger, a small group of scientists have lobbied against drugs, particularly marijuana, for the past 15 years. Most of the more active ones appeared as witnesses in 1974 hearings before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, chaired by Senator John Eastland. The subject was, quote, the marijuana hashish epidemic and its impact on United States security. The hearings bear significantly on the groups and personnel of the new war on drugs. One witness at the hearing was Dr. Robert Heath, whose background is interesting. Since the 1950s, Heath has been studying the human brain. Many of those years were spent working for the CIA and the U.S. Army. Heath was chairman of the Department of Psychiatry and Neurology at Tulane University that's huge MKUltra spot. Tulane University in New Orleans from 1949 to 1981, one of several Army research centers at which 3,000 doses of LSD were given to about 1,500 subjects in secret studies. When asked under oath if there was any other work he had done that would be relevant to his marijuana studies, Heath did not mention these earlier experiments. He also dabbled in questionable electroshock therapy and, quote, reprogramming. Heath's main contribution to the anti-drug war was his claim that marijuana causes changes in deep brain waves in humans. But since he is the only person who has conducted such experiments involving deep implantation of electrodes, his work cannot be confirmed. Also testifying at the hearings, initially behind closed doors because of his previous Pentagon work, was Dr. Hardin B. Jones. He said he had studied drug use in Southeast Asia through, quote, through the arrangements of Major General John K. Singlab, then Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Drug and Alcohol Abuse. Singlab, of course, is now most famous for his involvement in the World Anti-Communist League, WACL, and the Iran-Contra scandal. That's very true. Yeah, Singlab was like a major player in Iran-Contra. Jones did not limit himself to testimony on the health hazards of marijuana. Here's a nice one. He also presented his conspiratorial view that the New Left was promoting drug use as an attack on authority. He claimed as evidence of this plot, quote, files that I have brought here today and my files at Berkeley, literally thousands of such items, culled from the underground press and leftist publications. He even hinted that it might be a communist plan, as the Communist Party had not strongly discouraged drug use.
Well, does he mean the Communist Party in the United States, or
so?
in the Soviet Union? Because I'm pretty sure they did discourage drug use.
Yeah, they were pretty. I mean, if you want to talk about a legit anti-drug government that was protecting kids, definitely the Soviet government was not very kind.
I think my old roommate kept it, but I used to have that Niet drug, drinking.
The alcohol poster.
Yeah.
It's very classic. And of course, it's so fascinating that like, and maybe perhaps he's not wrong that the New Left in the U.S. did promote drug use in a variety of ways, but that's a knock on.
They were also a psyop, like that. So tune in, drop out.
Exactly. And
don't vote, don't do anything, just take LSD.
Take LSD and go to a commune.
The New Left, aka the CIA.
Exactly.
New Left,
so we see
the
again
left wing of the intelligence community,
as Gloria Steinem kind of called
exactly.
them.
Progressive.
I love that there were progressive men at the CIA who wanted to sponsor my fake feminism. So you constantly see this theme of like they're controlling kind of both sides of this conversation. They are freaking out and making all these wild allegations about the pervasiveness of drugs. They're kind of incorrectly lumping all these drugs in with each other in terms of like equating their severity, and then they're using it to call for like law and order crackdowns. And particularly, I think this gets into very murky water in the 90s when Gary Webb starts to like expose the Contra LA crack connection, because there's a lot of nits that get picked by kind of pro CIA people and quote unquote objective journalists at the time that really took issue with his insinuation that perhaps the CIA had deliberately flooded black neighborhoods with what it knew was going to be turned into crack cocaine, and that because I think I would take a little bit of an issue. I see what Richard Hatch is going for in this article, dismissing that there actually is a drug epidemic, but I think the overwhelming historical evidence is that crack cocaine at least was an epidemic in black communities in the 1980s and going into the 90s. And in certain parts of the country, but definitely in South Central Los Angeles, as sort of Ricky Ross and all of his associates talk about, it completely changed the landscape, which had been kind of on an economic downturn because mostly of deindustrialization and a lot of middle-class manufacturing jobs going away throughout the 1970s, which was a huge economic base of like the black community in Los Angeles. And in this like climate of high unemployment, poverty, desperation to find any way to kind of get out, all of a sudden this drug shows up. And it's incredibly easy to make money. Unfortunately, by design, if you're selling it in your own neighborhood, it is almost like a cannibalistic drug that is going to like socioeconomically like cannibalize your own neighborhood, right? Your own local population. And then you saw this like pattern play itself out. And then of course it wasn't just the fact that there was crack, but then it was like the violent police reaction to crack, and the kind of escalation of violence from the police and then also from gangs that basically caused even further damage. And then the way it was presented, I think that Richard Hatch is right that like the way it was breathlessly reported on the national news really was like perfectly designed to like freak people out, and probably particularly people in the suburbs or maybe people that worked in cities but didn't live there, white folks basically, and middle class white folks, like freaking them out about this crack thing. And it's like, like crack is like a bad drug, like it's worse than cocaine, and it's very much like meth today, which has kind of a more of a hold in like rural white communities. But it's almost, it makes you wonder about meth, like all these like rural white people, like just don't give them jobs, just let them tweak out, and it's a similar dynamic of like it's corrosive, like it undermines like having a safe, peaceful community, and it justifies the police running around and like, because it's like it's a fucking crackhead or it's a tweaker. So like, you know, they definitely, the media did a great job of like dehumanizing quote unquote crackheads as almost like zombies. And you know, going all the way up to like Dave Chappelle in the 2000s with like his like Crackman character. Remember that?
Yes. True.
Like I was reflecting on that this week, like leading up to this episode, and how, I don't know, like I think if you did it today, people would maybe be a little more sensitive to portraying a drug addict in like a homeless drug addict in that way. But there really was kind of like there was not very much sympathy for the crackhead, because they were seen as almost, they would get turned into like wild-eyed animalistic criminals, which of course probably a lot of white police officers and these police departments and stuff, probably that was already how they thought about a lot of the people in these communities. And but then it gave a broader societal license to go in and crack heads, and if you shot somebody, well, they were a crackhead, they were probably like, pulling a knife on you or something. And the Freeway documentary also like interviews some retired like LA Sheriff's Department people who describe how like the flood of cash into these communities completely like accelerated a culture of corruption in all the police departments, because the federal government made up these new rules about civil asset seizure and forfeiture in the early 80s. So this would have probably come from the Reagan Justice Department, which I think was Edwin Meese, who was like an extremely sketchy figure. And basically, like the new rule became, if you could raid a drug dealer's house, everything that you confiscated from them, the agency got to keep it. So they said it was not unusual to like bust some South Central crack dealer and he would have like $500,000 in his closet in cash. And then, of course, most of that's going to go back in the budget, so you can buy like bigger trucks, bigger guns, battering rams, all kinds of shit like that, and beef up your policing. But also, it's like a perfect opportunity to skim off the top. So all these cops, it became totally normalized for all these cops just to like skim off like, you know, 20 grand here, 30 grand there, and then they would, you know, they'd give it to their other people in their unit. One cop describes like sitting in his car outside of the station one day. The way he got quote unquote turned was like, one of his partners just walked up, threw him a paper bag and goes, "There's your cut." And he opened it and there was like, you know, $10,000 in it. And he said at that point, it's like, there's not even a conversation you have to have. Like, what you just think, like, I had to take this and now I'm a dirty cop and I'm corrupt and I go with it. And if I, you know, give it back or try to report it, then all of my fellow cops are going to look on me like I'm a snitch. And then how long is my career going to last? Are they going to, you know, they could do all kinds of shit to you, right? If you're not in on it with them. And so that culture was like really easily spread and just escalated like I said at the beginning, like to this day where we have cops that are like, you know, just rolling up and shooting people. A lot of this was like this paradigm of training and the heavy weaponry, like the, you know, cops going from having 6 shooters to having like an 18 round, you know, clip of like a Glock, and AR-15s and shotguns and stuff like that, like
tanks and transformers.
Literally. I mean, Daryl Gates, the LAPD chief, who was hilariously the head of, as a young man, was the head of like the special intelligence unit that investigated the Robert Kennedy assassination. So he did some good work for some people, it seems like, because then he got to be the chieftain of the LAPD until like the LA riots finally like forced him out. But he was a notorious innovator of the tactic of just like, if they got a tip that there was a drug house, they'd take that battering ram and just like rip off the front of your house and then just like leave it, and your house is ruined, and regardless of what they found. And so it was like literally like terrorism against like the black community in South Central LA on this like extremely unprecedented scale. But it was more sophisticated because it wasn't about going after, you know, Black Panthers or political people. At that point they had mostly crushed the Black Panthers, I think relevantly, like by bringing in heroin from the Golden Triangle, which is a tactic. I think when Richard Hatch talks in this article about how a lot of these like anti-drug warriors were recycled from Nixon's anti-drug campaign in the early 70s, in a way they recycled the drug flow of the early 80s as well, where they were bringing in heroin to the United States and flooding black, and I think at that point it was the mafia that was flooding black communities with it and helped undermine kind of a lot of the radicalism that was going on, in addition to COINTELPRO and all kinds of stuff. But even going up to 1980, drug arrests were not a significant percentage of the prison population nationally. It's actually, people forget now that even with like the 70s drug war, that the mass incarceration part of it only came about in the 1980s under Reagan, and by the time like Bush left office in the early 90s, but really through Clinton and the crime bill, which like Joe Biden supported, the percentage of people, it went to basically being like a majority of the people in prison of a population that had exploded were there for drug-related charges and hit with these like mandatory minimum sentences, which of course, you know, probably disenfranchised like millions of black men from voting for the rest of their lives and kind of put this scarlet letter on their record. So it was pretty hard for them to, you know, move up in life after that, and of course generated a ton of money for the prison industry, and just continually justified like the police like getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more, you know, really like it hushed up a lot of critiques people would have had about policing, because there was this scary crack epidemic that is like coming to your town next. And of course it kind of was, but like when the U.S. government are the people bringing it in, that's kind of like relevant to the whole thing that we're discussing. And of course, you know, the satanic concealment of that aspect of who's bringing in the drugs has had like a profound negative influence on society that's like still with us. Yes, it is satanic for sure.
It's
deeply satanic.
It really boggles the mind when you contemplate like that aspect of this stuff, and like just, you know, and it's something that connects, like it really is interesting because it's something that, I mean, there is definitely the class divide in terms of crack and cocaine, and maybe there's like almost an attempt, especially if you credit the idea of the CIA like fabricating crack, maybe there's some kind of, or creating it or doing things to help sort of generate this new drug. Maybe there, you know, is something to the like sort of the anxiety over like the incestuous sort of transmission of cocaine like through all like these different orders of society, and you know, the kind of the pollution of the circulation that's happening of these drugs, and then the use of it, and try to in some way manage that. But of course, I don't really think that it hasn't managed, and it still is true that it's something that really has its tendrils like throughout American society and beyond in a very like corrupt and, you know, very, I think, accurately called satanic way.
Damn, G, the spot's getting hot. So how the fuck am I supposed to make a knot? Police looking at niggas through a microscope. In LA, everybody and their mama sells dope. They trying to stop it. So what the fuck can I do to make a profit? Catch a flight to St. Louis. That's cool, cause nobody moves. We stepped off the plane. 4 gangbangers, professional crack slangers. Rented a car at wholesale. Drove to the ghetto and checked in a motel. Unpacked, then I grabbed a 380. Cause where we staying, niggas look shady. But they can't face South Central. Cause busting the cap is fundamental. Peeping out every block close. Seeing which one will clock the most. Yeah, this is the one, no doubt. Bustin' you, bone, and let's clear these niggas out. Hey, man, what's up, nigga? Let's nigga. Now clearing them out, mid-casualties. Still had the LA mentality. Bust a cap and out of there in a hurry. When you know, a drive-by in Missouri. Them fools got popped. Took that corner next day. Set up shop. And it's better than slanging in the valley. Triple the profit, making more than I did in Cali. Breaking up rocks like Barney Rubble. Cause them mark-ass niggas don't want trouble. And we ain't on edge when we do work. Police don't recognize the khakis and the sweatshirts. Getting bitches and they can't stand her. 1991 Tony Montana. Now the shit's like a war, a gang violence. Well, it was never seen before. Punks run when the gap busts. 4 Jericho niggas kicking up dust. And some of them are even looking up to us. Wearing our colors and talking that gang fuss. Giving up much love. Dying for a street that they never heard of. But other motherfuckers wanna stand strong. So you know the phrase. Once again, it's on.
At the top of the news tonight, gangs from South
The other thing they did do that Gary Webb found in the course of his investigations is that people, CIA people connected to Blandone. There's one guy named Ronald Lister who lived in L.A. and was an associate of Blandone's. He was involved in making contacts with the Crips and the Blood gangs and flooding South Central with military-grade assault weapons. So that's another thing that, like Ricky Ross and his associates say in that documentary, that, you know, people had guns and stuff, but like in 1983, 1984, you started seeing Uzis, AK-47s, MAC-10s, Tech-9s, like ridiculous, like, you know, Ricky Ross's partner was like in the Marines. He's like, man, like I hadn't seen that shit outside of like being in the military before. And all of a sudden it was like all over our streets. And so I think that actually lends probably like some credence to the idea that maybe there was a little more of a conscious, you know, direction going on with these CIA people being like, we want this to tear apart black neighborhoods. And you know, it also makes you think of actually the Furious Styles monologue from Boys in the Hood, John Singleton's movie, where Lawrence Fishburne is saying like, why is there a liquor store on every corner? Why, you know, they want us to kill ourselves. And he talks about gentrification. He's like trying to school everybody on like gentrification. And he's like, when we all like all these things, the drugs, the guns, like the, you know, liquor, crack, whatever, like it's all being deliberately flooded. He's kind of like an old Black Panther, you know, so he's like, it's being deliberately flooded so we can kill ourselves and like lower the property values. And then when we bottomed out, they're going to kick us all out and they're going to like buy all this stuff, all this urban land at like a bargain basement price, and then they're going to build it back up. And you know, you drive around LA today and I'll be damned if they haven't done that to like many neighborhoods that were ravaged by the crack epidemic and gangs and stuff like that. Like they were like very dangerous and like inexpensive places. And finally, like when the property values kind of like, you know, bottomed out, and then a lot of people literally got shipped off to like Bakersfield in the 90s and 2000s due to some kind of housing, some kind of Section 8 housing program. They almost like forcibly like moved poor people out into like the exurbs and other rural parts of California, and to kind of like, you know, depopulate these areas further so that then they can go in and like buy up all the real estate and then get these developers to come in. And you see that as like that's another national trend that happens almost in every city. And so like how, you know, I mean, yeah, bringing in assault weapons and stuff.
It makes perfect sense. Like, you know, I mean, this isn't too far removed from, we don't really have like thorough documentation, but this isn't too far removed from the same like political culture where we have Nixon saying all these like outrageously racist things. Like it's not too far away. Like, do you like just imagine what H.W. and Ronald Reagan would have said and expressed and really thought about black people behind closed doors, and like people who felt so empowered to you know, do things that were completely sociopathic. Like, why, you know, obviously, like, if they're surveying their kingdom and they're like, how do we, you know, cement our power? How do we exercise our control? They obviously had no trouble, like, with the idea of psychological operations being exercised against the American people.
Or lying, or like, cheating, you know, to, like, steal an election.
Yeah, so...
And I think it was H.R. Haldeman, the aide to Richard Nixon, who either later said in an interview or he was caught on tape, I forget which one, but he basically admitted that the actual purpose of the drug war was to criminalize specific drugs that could be tied to populations that they wanted to kind of fuck with and repress, which was basically associating marijuana with anti-war activists and hippies and leftists, and associating heroin with black people. And so at the time, those two drugs were the ones that they went after the hardest, you know, basically in a very politicized way to undermine what they saw as like domestic political threats. And you know, J. Edgar Hoover was still alive at that time, and he certainly saw that as, you know, he would say that like black radicals are the greatest national security threat, and we need, and of course anybody in like a new left organization is probably a communist agent, and or they might as well be treated as such, because fuck them. And so you see kind of like resurrection of that but then they found a different drug to do it with, and they found this particular variant, crack, which could accomplish it in a way that is kind of unparalleled, because well, there actually is. I just I had sort of an inkling that there might be, and there actually is like a Nixon tape with Ronald Reagan on it, where it was the day after the United Nations voted to recognize the CCP, People's Republic of China. And Reagan called Nixon to complain and sort of commiserate, and he says, last night I tell you to watch that thing on television as I did. Nixon was like, yeah, and Reagan forged ahead and said, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes. Ooh, so there you go. Yeah, Saint Ronnie.
That's the mine. And and I'm sure, I wonder if there's an HW racist tape. Probably. He's so tight. That's why I think it lends more credence to the idea that he was a lifelong intelligence officer, because he is so kind of tight-lipped about, and his son ended up signing another executive order right after 9/11 that classified the records of past presidents, which basically blocked off like a ton of access to documentation from the Bush and Reagan years. So he minds his P's and Q's, and I think he they weren't about
covers
to
his
let
tracks.
Nixon happen again.
He did launch the Willie Horton ad that was like, look at this black animal that like raped a white woman, right before he was caught on camera like shaking hands with like an OUNB leader who was like part of like Bill Casey actually built something called like the Republican like ethnic caucus or something like that was basically just a grab bag of like fascist and ex-Nazi like people from quote unquote captive communist countries. It was like all the Nazis and fascists and sketchballs who got kicked out of places like Cuba or Poland or Ukraine, and the OUNB was like deeply involved in that. Bush had to like denounce this guy because a photo came out of them like buddying up and shaking hands in 1988, but they were constantly flirting with these like Nazis all over the place. And you get especially because HW's dad, Prescott Bush, like did business with the Nazis like through the start of World War II and almost got prosecuted under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And you wonder if young HW was kind of brought into this network in the early 50s because his dad was so intimately connected with like this kind of nexus of like Alan Dulles and the Galen Org and groups like that were fanatically devoted to like undermining communism by any criminal means necessary, that he's been in this so long that he knows not to prattle off any racist kind of stuff. He very carefully kind of cultivated his image to be kind of a moderate guy, but if he was in fact, and I believe he was, like on both sides of this really oppressive, brutal drug war, and then bringing in all the fucking drugs, it boggles the mind like how evil that is, So it's hard to want you really, it's like staring into an abyss. Like how evil did George H.W. Bush go? And of course there's all kinds of conspiracy theories out there about him being a child sacrificing Satanist and things like that. But it's like, it really, I mean, like, who is this guy? Like this two-faced, like, sinister individual, who worked his way to the very top of the system. And then of course, he lost the presidency, but maybe that was a tactical pivot because there were still investigations ongoing about Iran-Contra. And I think if, it's worth thinking about that, like if he had won in 1992, then he wouldn't have been able to pardon all those guys who were still in the process of their cases were still ongoing, so they had all been indicted, but I don't think they had all been, maybe a couple of them pled guilty, but there was still ongoing stuff with Iran-Contra, and it would have dogged him. So what better way to just get them off your trail than to, you know, be the big man and take an L and let Clinton come in when you know Clinton's not going to pursue it because he was involved in the same exact shit.
Yeah.
And then you know, when people talk about the corruption of the Clintons, like this, I feel like this is the most important Clinton corruption story. Like, because it explains, it's like a Rosetta Stone that allows you to explain the whole arc of the Clintons' career and like their coziness with like the empire and the CIA and deregulating business and, you know, like these secret, even the Clinton Foundation. Like, I do believe there probably were a lot of like really shady, like, you know, operations for a variety of nefarious activities that they would have been a conduit for, because like they've been tainted almost since the beginning. Like, well before they got to the White House, they were corrupt and dirty. And they were, you know, I think when you look at how good of friends the Bushes and the Clintons became after Clinton got out of the White House and after Bush got out of the White, you know, they founded like a charity together to help Haiti. Doesn't that make your skin crawl? Yeah. You know, like Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Like I remember they did something about like the 2004 tsunami like disaster.
Came together. Yeah,
exactly, and it was like, what couldn't we get back to this where it's like bipartisan and blah blah blah.
Well, I remember when H.W. died, it was like he was the exact opposite of this Cheeto that, you know, like,
and I find that's what makes it hard when people talk about the existential threat of Donald Trump as like as sort of heinous and grotesque as he is, and you know, and he too is not necessarily exempt from having Iran-Contra connections. But I think we would need our own episode to like spin off into maybe he was, because there was a whole galaxy of money laundering going on to support all of this shit. And another thing, again, probably deserves its own episode, but the other thing that people might remember of 1987 was the savings and loans stock market crash and the scandal that resulted from that in, I think they called it like Black October, another October surprise, in 87, where the stock market totally went under because all these savings and loans ended up being caught like embezzling or lying about how much money they had, or they were involved in kind of weird like money laundering kind of things. And there was a big scandal about it, but nothing ever really, you know, stuck. I think a few people got kind of scapegoated, just like 2008. You know, a few people like Ivan Boesky and, you know, Michael Milken, who later became a big charitable like player that the Clintons were connected to. All that kind of stuff, like it tanked the stock market and caused like a severe recession. And there's a really good book. I haven't finished reading it. I've had it for a while, but it was by a Houston journalist named Pete Bruton called The CIA, the Mafia, and George Bush, published in the early 90s, that kind of advances a hypothesis that this whole network of like financiers that had backed Bush and Reagan politically, that were all like super tied to George H.W. Bush. A lot of them had mafia ties, a lot of them had CIA connections, and I think Pete Bruton tries to advance a thesis that the savings and loans collapse around the country had a lot to do with Iran-Contra money laundering. And of course, that had to be covered up and not talked about. And the media, of course, didn't do a very good job at all of kind of, you know, pursuing that lead in any way. And so I mean, it's like and then I don't know, it's kind of interesting how then, you know, Bush's son also has a catastrophic economic collapse that is based upon like shady financial practices at the very end of his term, and leaves us in like an economic wreckage, basically. Though Bush got elected president in 1988, so I guess people didn't even blame him for the savings and loans you know, catastrophe. But it's crazy to think that, okay, if you list all of these conspirators, they controlled the White House in an uninterrupted fashion from 1980 to 2008. 28 years.
Wow.
Think about that. Yeah, like the, you know, two terms of Reagan, one term of Bush, to finish the job, so to speak, which I think was ultimately to destroy the Soviet Union, and then Bill Clinton to be the cover-up fresh face, and then George Bush's son to basically take the Iran-Contra Enterprise to like the next level and, you know, really go mask off and like turn America into a global empire. And then you get, you know, Obama, who's like probably was recruited in the CIA in college, and whose mom was probably CIA and maybe dad was CIA. And that's the first somewhat of a break that you get from it. And it's like Obama's kind of too young to be directly connected with all of this stuff happening. But then you get Trump, and Trump even has connections in the 80s to all this crazy shit. So it's like, this is probably the most important political scandal of like the last, I don't know, 40 years. I think it's way more important than Watergate.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, these days we have like a Watergate level scandal like every single day, at least every single week. But yeah, I mean but yeah, you're right. It is the ultimate fallacy of like that, at least some of the myopia around Trump that exists. I think he's definitely like a really horrifying symptom of this long-standing political culture.
Yes.
But yeah, like for sure, the whole idea that when he's gone, then like everything will just go back to normal. Well, we'll see what happens. But,
we'll see what happens, but I think that
that's definitely an idea.
And of course, if it is President Biden, you will have somebody who at least was involved in the cracking down side of things. For sure. You know, he literally like I think he co-sponsored the rule that made like 1 gram of crack cocaine equivalent to like 5 kilos or some ridiculous fucking thing that basically made powder.
His vice presidential, running mate. That little girl was me. He ruined her life.
He ruined her life, but then she was able to follow his inspiring example to lock up tons of low-level drug offenders.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, so even you
it
can see
was not that big.
It was not that big. So you see it even infected the already kind of weak and gelatinous Democratic Party, but this mindset. Well, I will throw a little bit of a thing out for Senator John Kerry, who made some like ginger, I don't know how sincere they really were, attempts to follow up both. I think he did an investigation into BCCI and then also into the drug-Contra connection.
Yeah,
and
he did.
I guess he complained a lot about how the CIA wouldn't give him information, and he had a lot of trouble. I think he did manage to kind of like broadly say that like it was happening and they looked the other way or something along those lines. But typical John Kerry, who is a skull and bonesman, of course, and
I remember like I have this vivid memory of like my mom watching some like 60 Minutes type like boomery documentary about the Skull and Bones, like kind of like back during 2004, and like and the narrator being like, and George Bush isn't the only person in the Skull and Bones, and like then there's John Kerry, and my mom was just like I just have this very vivid memory of that. Like
I mean, for real, and they both got very mad at journalists who asked them about it and said, it's a private society and like I'm not going to talk about it. Even John Kerry. I think actually the Don't Tase Me Bro guy. Remember him?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He would at a college. He was like asking John Kerry about Skull and Bones, and then they tried to like drag him out, and then John Kerry just like sat there awkwardly while they tased him.
Yeah.
So right. You're not allowed to talk about that. But Mr. threw his medals over the White House fence. He failed to get to the bottom of this. And there was a guy named Lawrence Walsh who kind of was maybe the more direct comparison to Robert Mueller, who seemed to. He was actually still investigating it throughout the Bush presidency in the early 90s, but then he basically got just the door slammed in his face. And then I think when Bush pardoned all the people on his way out, that's what killed his investigation. And he wrote kind of a more mainstreamy friendly book called Firewall, which I haven't read, so I can't totally speak to like the value of it, but he at least was a little bit more downbeat than Arthur Lyman in saying like there was a deeper truth there. And I tried to get to it, but Bush basically he locked it down, and we're never going to have official confirmation that this happened. But I think given everything we've assembled here, I think it's
John Kerry did say in 1986, according to this Covert Action magazine,
yes,
from summer of 1987, he said in June 1986, the Contra infrastructure consists of the supply lines for the Contras used to move men, money, and supplies and munitions to the Contras. They have been able to gain a license, if you will, of access to airfields, of the muting of customs officials, an ability to be able to circumvent the law in the name of national security. In the name of national security, we can produce specific law enforcement officials who will tell you that they have been called off drug trafficking investigations because the CIA is involved or because it would threaten national security. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
yeah. They actually do seem to be.
Something.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Yeah. Props,
he went there a little bit, but it was kind of like, okay, Senator Kerry, that's nice. Nobody cares, and the media just kind of chose not to like run with it and make a big deal out of it. Which maybe when we get to the Larry King, Craig Spence kind of stuff, maybe the amount of people they had blackmailed had something to do with nobody wanting to talk, or just I don't know, anybody that said anything would get charged with 23 years for perjury in a federal court. I think maybe before we wrap up here, I think we mentioned in passing a couple of times, but I think I would implore people to go and watch the Montel Williams special from 1996 about the CIA crack connection, which features Gary Webb, the journalist, Mike Levine, the former undercover narc, and Representative Charles Rangel, who was a very suspicious presence there. There were a lot of Congressional Black Caucus who were very supportive of this idea, exposing this thing in the 90s, but then like Maxine Waters, who actually wrote the foreword to Gary Webb's book Dark Alliance, and some other South Central Congress people who arranged like the infamous town hall meeting where CIA Director John Deutsch went and got yelled at from everybody, and then Michael Rupert like called him out for being a drug trafficker, and it was kind of a PR nightmare. But then you like turn on the TV today and they're just talking about like Russiagate and how like we need to trust the CIA's judgment to like take out the orange president. And it's like, oh man, like I mean it's fine if you want to be against Trump, but like do you have to also bury like what happened to these people over time? Did they try to do something and then just saw that nothing was going to be acknowledged about it? Or again, is it like a Clinton thing where they know now that if they bring this up, it's going to take down the Clintons, and it's like mutually assured destruction for the two parties?
Yeah, I don't know. But I would say that, it's worth watching. Montel's really on one on this show, and it's like, I watched it with my friend last night again, and he was kind of blown away that this didn't become a big story, because he's like, it's like I'm watching an alternative universe of like the 90s, because like in terms of it being a story, they put tons of money into like they really marshaled like all their resources, all their like trained people at like controlling narratives and things like that into like exactly that, preventing it from being like a narrative, preventing it from being a story, and controlling the way this is processed and remembered. So I mean, it makes sense in a way.
And of course, the big fake news purveyors of yesterday and today were intimately involved in the cover up, like Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, basically all ganged up, and like they almost declared their own subliminal jihad against Gary Webb for publishing this series. And they actually LA Times assembled what they called a Get Gary Webb team. And like they had like a dozen journalists working around the clock picking apart his Dark Alliance series, and they were able to find like little nitpicky things that like were unverified, or like little tiny errors, and they basically blew it up into all these like huge stories about how like Gary Webb discredited, and particularly and an interesting thing about that is in the Freeway,
it's like mostly false, like actually
just really like I give this 3 Pinocchios for blah blah blah, but they basically ruined Gary Webb's journalistic career, and which then kind of ruined his life, and he like had to declare, I think, bankruptcy, and he lost his house. I think he got separated from his wife, and then in 2004 he shot himself 2 times in the head.
Yeah, love to commit suicide by just double tapping myself in the head twice.
I mean, a lot
classic
of people...
way to commit suicide. Yeah, especially when like you've pissed off H.W. Bush. It's just, the classic way to kill yourself,
It technically was, and much like maybe Mark Lombardi, the conceptual artist who died in 2000 when George W. Bush was running for president. This was in 2004, so a re-election year. And maybe Gary Wegg had some new, he had some juice left in the tank to go after the Bushes. And though... Of course, it should be mentioned that his ex-wife, Michael Rupert, Mike Levine, all these other people insist that, like, no, he really did kill himself. But they still blame the CIA and the media for ruining his life, which said, like, they basically hounded him till he had nothing left, and then he killed himself. But still, a little bit, Rick Ross.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's almost too perfect, but, I mean, it's totally possible that he did commit suicide in despair, and that, it was...
And if you do shoot yourself once, it is possible to not quite do it, and then you're going to shoot yourself again.
Yes,
but
come on. It's a little bit too. Yeah, it's a lot.
Either way, I do hold the CIA responsible for his death.
Yes.
That's how we should look at it. And I mean, so his thing was all. His life was ruined. Nobody else really could come out and say anything. Actually, an interesting thing is that Mike Levine says in the Freeway documentary, when they bring up like Gary Webb's suicide, he says like at that Montel show, he took Gary aside afterwards because Gary was kind of highlighting this theory that the CIA flooded black neighborhoods, targeted them specifically for crack and stuff like that. And I guess Mike Levine said something interesting where he's like, I took Gary aside and I said, Gary, man, you're going about this in a dangerous way because they're gonna make this into a black thing now. They're gonna say it's like a black conspiracy theory, and like I think you're and he's like, well, no, that's like not what I'm doing, Mike. Like I'm not trying to I'm just and he's like, yeah, but like when you sit there and let people say it and like you don't speak up to it, they're gonna pigeonhole you, and then that's how they're gonna get you and marginalize you. And he claims that like that's kind of what happened with it in a kind of weird way. Is that it? I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that.
That was what Montel was concerned about in the show too. That's what he kept saying. Like they're gonna say,
call me a
I'm
crazy
another black person. Yeah, exactly.
And it's worth noting the racism of, when we want to get into, if anybody's calling us conspiracy theorists, like you're actually racist, because that's racist as fuck, because that was a tactic that seemed to be somewhat effective in the climate of the 90s to say, oh, well, this is, the black community always says everything's like a CIA conspiracy. And they're just, they always have some nefarious explanation for the U.S. government's doing this to us on purpose. And now it's like, weirdly, that's more normalized now. The idea that the U.S. government would act in malice to disadvantage the black community or like actively do harm to them is much more, in a bizarre way, like kind of accepted on like mainstream news. Like people will talk all about it. They'll talk about the new Jim Crow and all this kind of stuff. But like it never gets to this point. At this point, I feel like you still would be called a paranoid, black conspiracy theorist if you were a black person that went on MSNBC and started talking about CIA crack in the 90s. That there would be a lot of nervous kind of, I don't know about that,
There's a lot of interesting issues at play when you think about again, this goes back to our theme when we're talking in a meta sense about the transformation, conspiracy, sort of culture over the past couple of decades. Because I was actually having a conversation with some of my friends, some of my friends in our Muslim group chat, shout out to Ram chat. So yeah, we were talking about Q, and someone said, well, we're talking about how Q is mostly a white phenomenon. It seemed that mostly the people who were into Q were white, and I sort of mentioned well, it's because Q is really, like, as we kind of talked about in an episode, it's like a messianic movement around Trump, and Trump is, like, much more popular among white people. Like, that's a very constitutive element of Q.
Yeah.
But, like, so I was like, well, how come black people don't, like, care about this, the pedos? And I'm like, well, really, like, black people have been into it for way longer.
Yes.
Like, it was considered to be, like, a crazy black thing, like, and even today there's, like, some remnants of that with, like, the, people scoffing at, like, the idea of, like, the Illuminati in the music industry. There's certain conspiracy theories that still have that kind of association and are
and they do have a strong currency often. It's not just like Mario from Vigilant Citizen, the evangelical, who's interested in like all this Illuminati music industry shit, but it is often, as we will talk about like next week, it is like black musicians and people in like rappers and hip hop artists and things like that have come out, and all the way up to like B.O.B. who talked about cloning centers and like flat Earth and like 2015.
Flat Earth, flat line. Flat line. Pulled us forward last time. Yeah,
exactly. But I think there is a lower threshold for kind of disbelief that something nefarious and organized like by rich people, who are usually like rich white people, is going on. I mean, these are the descendants of people who
because they've experienced them. People remember the Tuskegee experiment, and they remember like the denial. So there's distrust because it's 100% justified.
Yeah, they've been more exposed to it. Now people are
catching on. Like now it's like woke, but but again, and it's interesting how there are these transformations happening. But yeah, and like you could maybe tie this together with some of as a class thing where there's like now it's sort of associated with this like ignorant Southerners maybe, or sort of the Scots-Irish, there's some aspect of that there too, like alien abductees out there wearing the tinfoil hats. I mean, just spitballing, but there's interesting dynamics and the sort of instrumentalization of the idea of the conspiracy theorist and the different ways that it's racialized and understood. I mean, there's an aspect of that in the Muslim community with 9/11 conspiracy theories. That's also definitely a thing.
Because it affects your community directly.
Yeah,
it matters whether who did this and why and all these things.
Yes. And people witnessed the incredible crackdown and the deception and the spying that happened, and so there was a lot of distrust, and so, it is natural that people would be like, these people claim that they were Muslim. I remember one of my old imams back in New York would, or at that one of the masjid I used to go to, he would always say that, just because Muslims did this, or people who were told are Muslim, whenever they mentioned that.
Well, sure. I mean, Muhammad Atta, as Daniel Hopsicker wrote in his book Welcome to Terrorland about the hijackers' lifestyle in South Florida, Muhammad Atta, pretty big fan of strippers and cocaine and getting drunk. And,
they did haram. They did haram.
They did a lot of haram.
Yes. Yeah, so...
Makes you wonder.
Anyway, but we'll definitely talk at least some of the stuff down the line for sure.
And I think I'm not sure what our next kind of installment on Iran-Contra would be. It might have to be like Larry King, Craig Spence, maybe the third. I don't know if we maybe do that and maybe build up to the grand finale, which I think was like the Project Hammer destruction.
Right,
maybe not Project Hammer, but like the grand destruction of communism, which is like the satanic goal that all these people were pursuing the entire time, the thing that in their minds justifies everything they did. But I think we definitely got to get in the little pedo ring angle, because if maybe you think that selling cocaine is cool and you're not morally shaken to the core yet that these people are absolute psychopaths.
But, maybe you're one of the listeners we picked up from Red Scare, and you are a proponent of cocaine.
You just think it's like whenever.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever. I mean, we definitely got some of the Vocal Fry audience, I think. Definitely, like the Vocal Fry enthusiasts. Maybe there's some crossover, coming from.
I welcome everyone. Really.
Yeah, for sure.
But for now, I think we can wrap it up there. I think we're just about 3 hours, so I think that was a good healthy ep. I hope we've impressed upon the true history of the war of drugs.
If anybody tells you that it's cool to fund like a paramilitary death squad in a Latin American country, just say no.
Just say no. Exactly. Say no. So yeah. Yes. Don't say yes to that. And and until
Dare
next time.
to not say yes.
Yeah. So we'll see y'all next time. For those who want to catch us, the next episode we're gonna take a brief detour into maybe all of this, maybe a kind of broad cultural zeitgeist of the early 80s from a Soviet perspective. Next time,
that's all Lara
on the all-wire frequency. So if you want to hop on that,
will be the one we
you can go to patreon.com/supplemental-jihad and hop on the all-wire frequency. You can also get all this. You can also get all the links and show notes of all the many articles and books and YouTube documentaries that we discussed in this little marathon. But we will be back on the public frequency next week to talk about Memphis horrorcore and get into some really Halloween-y stuff.
Yes, it's spooky season has begun in earnest. It's truly underway. Yeah, so
it truly is. So we'll see y'all there. But until then, until next time, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
True American horror, Reaganomics, Night of the Living Baseheads, Iran-Contra. The CIA ran guns and drugs from Nicaragua, looking for a front to cover a black market. Run black ops, blindfold the Congress, and funnel poor people into cells for a profit. Listen to the evil that these devils concocted. Listen to the evil. The real Rick Ross was an everyday hustler who was propped up by agents undercover, blinded by pride to the lies of another. They disguised as a port of Miami drug runner, supplied with ingredients to fire up the oven. Next thing you notice, every block got flooded, buying up the freeway, flying up above it. He thought he was a don till they played him like a puppet. Little did he know that he was copping from the government. DEA agents engaged in the smuggling. LAPD battered ran amok with it. Meanwhile, Ricky's in the cell on some sucker shit, locked in the box while they pardon them other men. 20 years later, came home disgusted. Turn on the radio, Rick Ross running shit. What the fuck is this? Now some white kids bumping and imagine they hustling. Found with some white in the bag and that's nothing. 25 to life for crack, well that's justice. Sorry I'm a hater, but my anger's so productive. Said he was the truth, so we had to discuss this. Drug dealer fantasy America's in love with. From hip-hop to TV shows, the world is a trap cause God's a CO.
You know, when you're young and you're impressionable,
and the devil is alive,
then you see something, you say, oh man, that shit is real.
The devil is alive. Sell drugs, get rich. Another rapper spitting bullshit. Schools closed, locked in. Killer cops occupied by the dope biz. Overdose to the double homicide. Bow your head cause a lot of people died. It went away for just trying to survive. Motherfucker, cause the devil is alive. Is it truth or it's fiction? Is it you or the fiction? When they strung out on that shit and the youth come up missing, or they laying on the table in the room for a mission. It's a tragedy of fools. This is true people's history. Calling it a war, but it's more like an industry. Cautionary tale how they profit off of misery and sell it right back to the poor who they consider cheap. The re-up and repeat is retaught and retold. It's rebought and reused till they come and repo.
Just like with the rapper that's using my name, Rick Ross, I believe he's giving kids the wrong impression that you can go out and sell drugs. And
we mentioned obviously that Reagan was in power when he authorized this secret war down there. But you know, Clinton's in power now, and now those are the folks who put Danilo Blandone on the federal payroll. I mean, the guy that brought crack to L.A. is now a federal government employee.
Because the devil is alive.